Am I the asshole for selling my Taylor Swift tickets after my girlfriend cheated? A few months ago, I, 27M, won some money and decided to do something special for my girlfriend, 25F. She's a huge fan of Taylor Swift and has been for years, so I thought it would be a great surprise to get us both tickets to see Taylor Swift in Vancouver. I knew this would be a dream come true for her, so I went all out. I spent about $800 on 2 great tickets, and I couldn't wait to experience the concert with her. However, last week, I found out something that completely shattered me. I discovered that my girlfriend had been secretly meeting up with her work friend for months behind my back. The way I found out was completely accidental. She had been using my laptop to print something, and when I opened it up later, I saw that her Instagram DMs were still open. I couldn't help but glance at them, and what I saw completely blindsided me. There were weeks of flirtatious messages between them, along with plans to meet up. When I confronted her about it, she initially denied everything, but eventually, she admitted to having kissed him several times and to having what she called an emotional affair with him. To say I was devastated is an understatement. I felt completely betrayed. These tickets were supposed to be something special for us, a way to celebrate our relationship, and now it felt like I could never enjoy them with her after what had happened. I couldn't bring myself to go to the concert with her after discovering what she had done. So instead, I decided to sell the tickets. The Taylor Swift ticket market is crazy right now, and I was able to sell the 2 tickets for $2,400, 3 times what I had originally paid for them. When she found out that I sold them, she completely lost it. She started calling me nonstop, texting me angry messages, and telling me how petty and cruel I was. She said that I had ruined her dream and that the tickets were a gift, so they should belong to her. Her friends have also been texting me, calling me awful and saying that I used the tickets to hurt her. I understand that she's upset, but I don't think I did anything wrong. I bought those tickets with my own money, and after what she did, I didn't want to keep them or give them to her. I feel like I had every right to sell them. But now I'm second-guessing myself because of how much everyone is making me feel like I crossed a line. So, am I the asshole for selling the tickets? I blamed my twin sister for how my parents treated me growing up and ruined our relationship. And it sucks this is going to be a long one, and I apologize in advance. I've been carrying a lot of guilt and frustration for a long time, and I just need to get this off my chest. My twin sister, and I have been through a lot growing up, especially since our parents divorced when we were only 2 years old. I don't think I realized it at the time, but our family dynamic had a huge impact on both of us. I'll start with one incident that stuck with me. One year, during the long weekend before school started, the kids next door and I were all playing on the swing set in my dad's backyard. I went inside to use the bathroom, and when I walked back out, my dad was standing on the back deck looking at me with anger in his eyes. He said, "How could you do that to your sister?" I had no clue what he was talking about, and before I could ask, he rushed inside. I went outside and found a group of adults from the neighborhood gathered around my sister, who was crying. I looked around and realized my dad was inside on the phone. Turned out that M had fallen off the swing and broken her arm. My dad had assumed I pushed her and told my mom that over the phone. Minutes later, my mom and an ambulance arrived. She looked at me and immediately asked how I could have hurt my sister. I was in shock. I told her the truth. I had been in the bathroom and hadn't touched her. But she didn't believe me. M went to the hospital and got a cast, but the damage was done. My parents kept repeating, "How could you do that to your sister?" I tried to defend myself and asked M to tell them the truth, but she wouldn't or couldn't remember what happened. I'm not sure why, but it left me feeling completely isolated and blamed. Fast forward to our first Meet the Teacher event at a new school. My mom introduced us to the teacher by saying, "This is M, my good child, and this is A, my bad child." I was mortified. This wasn't a one-time thing. She started introducing us like this to every teacher, coach, neighbor, or even strangers she met. Sometimes, she switched it up to calling me the angel and M the devil child, just to keep it fresh. This constant labeling made me feel like I was always the problem, always the one who was in trouble. Over time, I started internalizing that narrative. I was being treated as the bad child, and I began acting like it. I took my frustration out on M. I bullied her, pushed her, and was mean to her because, in my mind, if she just told my parents the truth, that I didn't push her, maybe they would stop treating me like this. I thought maybe I could change their perception of me. But the more I pushed my sister away, the worse things got. I became the bad child they always said I was. Eventually, I had a bitter realization. This bad child label wasn't my fault. It was my parents' doing. They were the ones who put me in that box, not M. But by then, the damage to my relationship with my sister had already been done. I treated her horribly for years, and I didn't blame her for pulling away from me. As I got older, I decided to try to be the perfect child. I stopped treating him badly, worked hard in school, got a job, and tried to follow all the rules. But even then, things never went back to the way they were. The damage was already too deep. Now, as adults, I really wish we could have the kind of close, supportive relationship that typical twins share. M is having a baby soon, and seeing her go through this big milestone makes me wish we could celebrate it together. As sisters, I want to be there for her, but I feel like I ruined that chance by mistreating her for so many years. I ruined our relationship, and it's hard to accept. I just wanted to share this because I feel like I've been carrying this weight alone for so long. I know I can't undo the past, but I really regret the way I treated her, and it hurts every day. Thanks for listening. Am I the asshole for leaving my friend when she brought someone I don't know to our meetup? So I, 20F, had arranged to meet up with my friend Jess, 20F, for coffee. We planned it a week in advance, and I was really looking forward to it. We've both been busy with life, and it had been a while since we'd had time to catch up one-on-one, just the two of us. Here's some context. I really don't like when my friends bring other people, especially people I don't know, to meetups that were originally intended to be just the two of us. I don't mind hanging out with new people in general, but I prefer to know beforehand if someone is going to be there. All my friends are aware of this, and Jess has been told about it before. Today, when I showed up at the cafe, Jess surprised me by bringing along a girl named J, 20F, who I had never met. There was no prior notice or heads up, and I had expected it to just be the two of us. As you can imagine, I was caught off guard. I tried to be friendly to J, but I could tell I was visibly annoyed. It felt uncomfortable because I had been planning to catch up with Jess on a personal level, sharing some casual life updates, the kind of things you talk about when reconnecting with a friend. Instead, I felt like I was being forced into small talk with someone I didn't know. It was just awkward. I couldn't get into the flow of the conversation, and the whole meetup felt off. I didn't feel like I could talk to Jess about some things that I normally would because I wasn't comfortable with Jay being there. I had hoped for a relaxed, one-on-one hangout, but it ended up being a tense, three-person encounter that didn't feel like what I had expected. After a while, I was really frustrated and decided to leave early. I made up an excuse, saying I had to study, and told Jess we could reschedule for next week. She was clearly upset when I left, and ever since then, I've been getting a ton of angry texts from her. She's calling me rude and inconsiderate and accusing me of being unfair. At first, I didn't think I did anything wrong, but now I'm second-guessing myself and wondering if I overreacted. So, am I in the wrong for getting mad at her for this? Edit. Okay, I can see there are mixed opinions, and I appreciate all the feedback, even if it's not what I wanted to hear. I should have clarified a few things. Sorry for the confusion earlier. I rushed the original post. When I mentioned keeping her word, I meant that the last time I talked to Jess about this issue, a few months ago, she said she understood and promised she wouldn't bring anyone without telling me first. I guess I assumed she would remember that conversation, but I realized I never reminded her or brought it up again. That's on me. Also, to give more context, Jay is a friend of Jess's from college. Jess has never mentioned her to me before today, which is why it threw me off. If Jess had talked about Jay at all, I think I would have been less surprised. But since I didn't know who she was, it made me feel uncomfortable. Just to clarify further, my issue isn't with meeting new people in general. If I wanted to meet new people, I'd go to a party or an event where that's expected. My problem was that I thought this was going to be a one-on-one coffee date, and instead Jess brought someone along without giving me a heads up. I'm asking for judgment on my reaction to that unexpected situation, not about my stance on meeting new people. We stopped leaving the garage door open when we were cooking because I told my mom the police were saying criminals had been stealing equipment from garages. My dad was away on an engineering work contract in Dubai like half the uncles I knew, so we kids were left to help our moms with everything from house maintenance to legal compliance. Back then there was no internet and overseas phone calls to Dubai were expensive, so there were a great many things left unreported to the dads. To compensate for this lack of communication, my mom and all the aunties dutifully reported everything and anything to each other, forming an Alif-wide Desi Wives network. They'd spend several hours a day stretching the extra long coil of their kitchen's wall-mounted phones as they tended to house work and the just as important work of informing one another whose husband was laid off and whose contract was renewed, when Fiesta would be getting the next shipment of good mangoes, and where Coke was on sale this week. Most aunties in Alif didn't work outside the house, but half of the Desi aunties in Alif ran a side hustle from their home. There were several other aunties running mini catering businesses like my mom. One or two had some kind of jewelry business because their family in India were in the business. You could narrow down which ones likely sold gold or diamonds because they had metal bars on their windows and doors. Of course, not everyone who had caged their houses were brown jewelry dealers. Some were scared white people who hadn't yet moved to Sugarland or Katy. Those were emerging suburbs with fewer crimes and less brown people. A handful of the more self-assured aunties had secured real estate licenses and begun catering to Desi clientele who were also moving to Sugarland or Katy. Then there was an auntie who ran an unlicensed beauty salon in her guest bedroom. Mostly she threaded eyebrows and female mustaches. Bikini waxes weren't a thing, at least officially, because nobody would go to a fellow Desi to get it done. Hell, just shaving your legs was a confession of interest in attracting the opposite sex, which was a super terrible interest to have. Bisharam. Shameless. The aunties would cluck judgmentally at Hindi movie actresses wearing shorts and tube tops, but I heard some Desis living here in Alif got more than their arms waxed, and I thought how they must be absolutely fearless to be so bisharam. I secretly admired the beautician auntie who served the bisharam among us, quietly and without judgment tending to whatever a woman needed done in order to feel good. I wished my mom was a beautician doing modern American things instead of a cook making Desi food as if we were all still in India. My mom had lugged 2 oversized, overweight bags stuffed with jumbo stainless steel pots and masala from India in order to authentically cook nasta, snacks, and typical Guju food like dal and tomato batata shak for people's parties. Before going to India to visit her parents, she had fresh red chilies, ajwain, cinnamon, cardamom, black pepper, and other seeds and pods delivered to my grandparents' rooftop back in Valsad so they could roast under the sun for a week. When she arrived, she called 3 women over for 2 days to ground all the masala using a giant stone mortar and pestle. She sat up there on the baking hot rooftop to supervise them, nitpicking about every little thing. I'd never seen my mom be the boss of anyone, so this was interesting. Back in Houston, she exhibited a stealthy fear of authority figures, and a lot of people fell under this category. White people in general, police, security guards, teachers, doctors, receptionists, and grocery store clerks were seen as people to be obeyed. But for her masala, she scaled her wall of fear and straight up lied to the U.S. Customs officer and said we didn't have any uncooked agricultural products in our luggage. I wasn't sure if the spices counted, but I knew for sure the plant roots of half a dozen Desi veggies we had wrapped with some good Desi soil intact was definitely uncooked, so I had tugged at her sari to remind her about that, to which she responded by stomping on my foot. It would probably crack actual criminals up to learn that my mom feared them stealing her pots and fresh masala stored in our rusty old Sears garage fridge. But I knew that to my mom this was a very plausible criminal plot. From within those steel pots she dished out her self-worth. Everyone liked my Kadi so much, she'd report to her children as if we had asked. My mom had been married off a month before graduating from college. She met my dad once. They ate doses at a snack shop on their one and only date before their parents fixed a wedding date to fit within my dad's 3-week wife-hunting trip to India. My mom had hoped to complete her degree in another month, but his time was more important than hers from the start, I guess. So this vegetarian, non-English speaking, 20-year-old high school graduate, moved to America with a man she had known for 2 weeks. My dad tried to make her eat hamburgers in order to fit into America, and also because back then there were no stores where you could buy Indian groceries. She resisted and figured out how to make Indian food by improvising with American groceries. Over time, she built a reputation, and other Desis started asking her to cater for their parties. The steel pots were my mom's gold. Of course, she could imagine someone wanting to steal them. The truth of why we cooked with the garage door closed was that one day when Henry Lopez and I were walking home from the bus, he had sniffed the air and groaned, "Wwwww," and then pretended to gag and vomit as he shouted, "Something smells like a gigantic fart." I knew the smell well. My mom was cooking undiyu and puris for an order that night. Undiyu made her a little famous around Houston. She grew the papdi and rutaru in our backyard for it after smuggling their roots from India. There were about 25 different spices and ingredients in her authentic undiyu, and half the vegetables only grew for a few months. Back in India, people apparently celebrated the season by having undiyu parties. I figured it must be like the crawfish boil parties that non-Desi, meat and fish eating people in Houston go crazy about. Undiyu smelled pretty good to me, but every spring when the grocery stores boiled crawfish for sale, my family silently gagged at the smells, but smiled politely when we were offered samples. Everyone has to make a living, this we understood. Undiyu season was second only to Diwali in terms of my mom's catering profits, and with oil and gas companies laying people off every other month. My mom's cooking was our safety net in case my dad got sent back abruptly from Dubai. It hadn't happened to us yet, but we lived in fear of it. She did all her catering cooking in the garage because my dad said the heat from the cooking drove up the AC bill unnecessarily. So she'd put on one of her Indian nighties that permitted the most airflow while covering her legs for modesty, squat on a footstool, and preside over a couple of portable gas stoves placed in the middle of the garage floor. She'd spread newspapers out on plastic folding tables and plop the freshly fried puris onto them. And all this is what Henry Lopez did not need to see and judge. My mom, long black hair in a single braid down her back, in a bright paisley miu-miu, sweat dripping from her forehead, methane-perfumed clouds billowing from the gigantic vat below her. I could just imagine her looking up from her pot and smiling, offering Henry a puri, and Henry laughing or gagging or fake puking. I winced at the thought, which I took to be a certain premonition, and my pulse and my pace quickened. Henry and I didn't exactly walk home together, because the laws of the universe would never permit such a thing. Physics dictated that his longer, sports star legs carried him further, faster than me. And social justice required me to stay well enough away from Henry so that nobody could misconstrue my presence as evidence of being his middle school popularity equal, much less girlfriend. To sidle up next to Henry would be to risk his scorn. It was far safer to walk well behind him and imagine that he secretly liked me. But Henry's ruckus had to be shut down before he reached my house, so I hugged my trapper keeper extra hard as I ran to catch up to him. My French horn case banged violently and rhythmically against my knee with each footfall. A few pieces of loose leaf paper flew out, probably the math homework I finished in homeroom so I could watch Facts of Life with my undivided attention. I let them fly in the wind. I didn't care. All that mattered was intercepting loudmouthed Henry before he got to my driveway. My house came first before Henry's. As I neared him, I pretended to also be repulsed and thoroughly confused by the stench. I screwed up my mouth and eyes emphatically as I looked quizzically into Henry's eyes as if to say, "What hideousness is this?" We had 8 more houses and 1 intersection before mine. You could get to Henry's house from the intersecting street too, but Henry liked to tease our neighbor's dog, so he preferred the longer route past my house. In my daydreams I imagined Henry and I becoming a secret item. Secret because of course he was actually well above my station in middle school life, and anyway I wasn't allowed to have a boyfriend, much less a non-Gujarati, not even Indian boyfriend. For such a relationship to be out in the public wold be the hilt of being Basharam. Sometimes I'd dream that I'd talk Henry out of teasing Snoopy, explaining that Snoopy was Mrs. Polk's only living friend and that he was just barking and going crazy because he needed to protect Mrs. Polk. In the dreams, Henry would give in and promise not to tease Snoopy. But that was a dream, and deep down I knew that Henry was a real-life jerk, which was why he was popular and maybe why I was not. I'd need to distract Henry with something more fun than teasing Snoopy. I recalled how girls in sitcoms hit on their male targets and felt that my whole life of TV watching had prepared me for this moment. Without thinking, I launched my offensive. Hey, can I come over to your house? We could maybe watch TV or something. Your mom's not home for a couple of hours, right? I managed to say most of this without stuttering, as if I was a feathered hair American girl in cut-off jean shorts and spaghetti-strap top blowing fruity bubble gum bubbles rather than a lightly mustached Desi girl in Kmart Wrangler jeans clutching an overstuffed Trapper Keeper in one hand and a French horn case in the other, my upper lip fuzz glistening with tiny sweat beads. My face blazed with shame and my stomach braced for the gut punch. And yet still, somehow, a sliver in me thought maybe he did secretly like me. Henry's eyes narrowed as he peered at me, as if I'd gone crazy. He gazed down at my pragmatic tennis shoes and moved his gaze up my stiff Wrangler jeans, my JCPenney logo polo and sweaty armpits, and finally my glasses resting lopsided at the tip of my bulbous nose. No way, Jose. Gag me. And with that, he turned toward the intersection and headed directly home. My mother's pride left intact while my own lay shattered on the suburban sidewalk. I wanted to cry, but I was too close to home. As I approached our driveway, my mom looked up and smiled. Garam garam puri joyi? Do you want nice warm puris? It was just as I'd imagined. Only Henry wasn't there to insult her for being resilient, resourceful, and gracious. I smiled and nodded yes, put down my Trapper Keeper and French horn to reach for a puri, and began telling her about the police officer that stopped me at the corner to let me know bad guys were checking out garages for things to steal. Maybe we should keep the garage door closed, I casually suggested. The Three Little Pigs Incident. A building inspector's report by B.B. Wolf, Senior Building Inspector, Woodland District Code Enforcement Division, let me set the record straight. After 27 years with the Woodland Building Department, WBD, I've seen every construction shortcut and code violation imaginable. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to the infamous Three Pigs incident of 2023. The media had a field day with it, of course. Big Bad Wolf terrorizes innocent homeowners. Please, I enforced the International Building Code, 2021 edition, with local Woodland amendments. It all started with an anonymous tip to our department's compliance hotline. The caller, who I would later discover was a rather fastidious beaver from upstream, reported unauthorized construction activities in the Lower Woods District. 3 new structures had appeared virtually overnight, with no posted permits, architectural drawings, and highly questionable materials. As the senior inspector for Zone 4, the case landed on my desk. I looked over our records first, following the protocol. No building permit applications, no site plans, no structural calculations, no soil testing reports. In a designated high-wind zone with seasonal flooding concerns, this was more than just negligent, it was dangerous. The preliminary site photos from our code enforcement team were alarming. There were 3 different buildings. One looked like it was made entirely of straw, which is against IRC section R301.2.1. Another was made of unmilled stick assemblage, which is against at least 6 different structural integrity codes. And the third was made of brick, which might be okay but still needs to be inspected and certified by a professional mason. I scheduled the inspections for the following morning. Standard procedure dictates we notify property owners 48 hours in advance, but Municipal Code Section 109.3 allows for immediate inspection in cases of imminent structural failure. Given that our meteorological department had forecast 40 miles per hour winds for the coming week, I invoked this clause. The first house, the straw construction, was a textbook example of what not to build. I approached at exactly 9 a.m., clipboard in hand, wearing my department-issued khakis and building inspector badge displayed. I knocked on what generously could be called a door. Little pig, let me come in, I called out, using our department's legally mandated greeting, which our legal team should honestly update for professional standards. Not by the hair of my chinny chin chin, came the reply, which is not an acceptable response in our inspection protocol manual. I adjusted my hard hat and double-checked that my inspection credentials were visible. Sir, I am a licensed building inspector with the Woodland Building Department. I need to conduct an immediate safety evaluation of these premises. Go away. We're not falling for it, Wolf. This kind of species-based discrimination is unfortunately common in code enforcement. I filed many complaints with HR about it, but that's a battle for another day. I pulled out my tablet and began documenting the violations. No footer, no foundation, no structural support members of any kind. The straw wasn't even properly secured to meet basic wind resistance requirements. One good gust could send the whole structure into the protected owl habitat next door. I sighed and did what any responsible inspector would do. I tested the lateral force resistance. One huff and puff load test later, and my worst fears were confirmed. The entire house collapsed, failing to meet even the most basic standards of IRC section R 301.2.1. The owner came scrambling out and ran toward the second house before I could even issue a stop work order. I noted, inspection refused, structure deemed unsafe on my form, and moved on to the next property. The stick house was, if possible, even more egregious. Untreated lumber, no hurricane ties, zero consideration for lateral bracing. The owner of the first house was already inside with the second pig, and they both refused to acknowledge my official capacity. Little pigs, let me come in. I tried again, holding up my inspector's badge. Not by the hair of our chins. Two voices this time, equally obstinate. I pulled out my inspection checklist and began noting violations. No fire stops, no egress windows, no proper load path to the foundation. The list went on and on. Again, I was forced to conduct a lateral stability test. One huff and puff, and, well, you can guess what happened. Both pigs fled to the brick house while I was still writing up the notice of violations. Now, the brick house, I'll give credit where it's due. The masonry work showed promise, but it still needed proper inspection and certification. By this point, all three pigs were inside, and they were becoming increasingly hostile. This is your final warning, I announced. I am authorized under Building Code Section 104.6 to conduct a thorough inspection of these premises. Failure to comply will result in significant fines and possible criminal charges. They responded by barricading the door with what sounded like unpermitted furniture additions. Do you know how many occupancy regulations that violates? I spent the next hour conducting external measurements and documenting numerous violations. Improper setback from the property line, non-conforming roof pitch, missing moisture barrier, and unauthorized decorative fixtures. I could hear them inside the whole time, probably concealing evidence of further violations. That's when I noticed the chimney. A major code violation if I ever saw one. No spark arrestor, no proper flashing, not even basic tuck pointing between the bricks. It was my duty to investigate. What happened next has been grossly misrepresented in the media. Yes, I attempted to gain entry through the chimney for inspection purposes. Yes, there happened to be a pot of water on the fire below. But it was they who lit the fire when they heard me coming. I have the burn marks on my tail to prove it, and workers' comp is still processing that claim. The subsequent departmental review cleared me of any wrongdoing. My methods were deemed unorthodox but within inspection guidelines. The first two structures were condemned and demolished exactly as they should have been. The third house was eventually brought up to code, though I suspect they only hired a licensed contractor because of the hefty fines they received for the first two attempts. I'll admit, I might have been a bit zealous in my pursuit of code compliance that day. But when you've seen as many structural failures as I have, the collapsed treehouse of 19, the Great Beanstalk disaster of 20, the Three Bears non-permitted addition incident, you learn that ignoring building codes costs lives. The media never published my full inspection report, of course. They were too busy painting me as the villain, making up stories about me wanting to eat the pigs. Please, I'm a vegetarian who believes in tofu construction, with proper permits, naturally. But try explaining that to a public that's already made up its mind about wolves in building inspection. The real tragedy here isn't my damaged reputation or even the waste of building materials. It's the ongoing crisis of unpermitted construction in our forest communities. Every day, innocent animals put their lives at risk by living in structures that don't meet basic code requirements. Last week, I received a memo that the department is considering revising the inspection protocols, making them less intimidating and more community-friendly. They're even talking about changing our official greeting to a simple good morning. Where's the tradition in that? Next thing you know, they'll be telling us to stop huffing and puffing altogether and just use standard testing equipment like every other municipal inspection department. But I'll adapt, as I always have. 27 years on the job, and I've never lost my commitment to keeping our woodland residents safe through proper building code enforcement. Though I have to admit, I'm looking forward to retirement. I've got my eye on a lovely little cottage in the 100-acre wood. Fully permitted, of course, with all the proper documentation. I did the final inspection myself. For now, though, I'll keep doing what I do best. Protecting our community from the dangers of substandard construction, one inspection at a time. And if anyone tries to tell you I'm the bad guy in this story, just ask to see their building permits. In my experience, those who cry wolf the loudest usually have something to hide. Addendum asterisk for those interested in the full inspection reports and photographic evidence. They're available through Freedom of Information Act request at the Woodland Building Department. Reference number THR PIG 2023. Though I should warn you, the permit office is currently backlogged by 3 months. Budget cuts, you know how it is. Asterisk the views expressed in this report are those of the author and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Woodland Building Department. Any resemblance to actual pigs, living or relocated, is entirely coincidental. Asterisk. My sister has always had a soft heart. Soft as sweetbread. She cried after the old woman, despite everything. Maybe because of everything. I remember holding her as she wept, both of us covered in soot. Her fingers scalded from holding shut the oven door. After the tears, she was quiet. She trailed me through the awful house with its sweetbread walls and sugared windows. I found the clothes we'd arrived in, offered up her kirtle, and she donned it without a word. She showed no whisper of response when we found the treasure in the attic, only nodded vaguely when I asked her to help me fill up the few bags we could easily carry back through the woods. Maybe it would be enough. Enough to keep us safe from our stepmother's whims. I do not want to go back there. It was the first she'd spoken in hours. I hesitated outside the witch's cottage, looking back over my shoulder at her. I do not want to go back to them. I sighed. Nor do I. But where else can we go? She wrung her fingers together in front of her skirt, eyes downcast and her teeth digging into her lower lip. Eventually, though, she nodded. Fine. You are right. She looked back at the house. Wait 1 minute. There may be something left in the kitchen. The kitchen. I repeated in horror, but she only nodded. Yes, she did not think I paid attention, but I did. I know which of her potions might be useful if nothing else. We can sell them when we get back. I nodded slowly and followed her back into the cottage, though I stopped in the open arch that led into the kitchen itself. She moved easily through the space, reminding me painfully of just how long she had been under the witch's thumb while the horrid crone tried to fatten me like a prize hog. She collected some dozen bottles and vials, tucking them carefully in between the bolts of silks and satins we had pilfered from the attic before returning to me. Let us go. Though there was no trail this time, she seemed to know her way through the trees. I asked how once when we paused to wait out the dark, but all she said was that she simply knew now. As though the forest spoke to her. In a way it hadn't before. I felt the first thrill of fear at that. But I knew that she was still so scared herself. I refused to let her see it. I tried to coax her into dreaming about what sort of life we might have with the witch's pilfered treasure, and managed to earn a wan smile for my efforts. But it was cold and dark, and soon enough we simply huddled together under a gnarled tree as we waited for the deepest part of night to pass. When grayish dawnlight began to filter through the leaves, she was the first to stand. She had gone quiet again, and only answered me with faint hums or single words as we continued on our way. She seemed more comfortable to be leading us now, but something in the set of her shoulders reminded me of something. Something I could not quite name. Eventually, I lapsed into her silence. When the trees broke apart to reveal the familiar shape of our father's home, she froze. Then she broke into a run, and I was only half a step behind her. The door was already opening when we reached the stoop, and our father met us with his arms open and tears in his eyes. He held us close and apologized, over and over, praising the Lord's name. I embraced him in turn, but alongside the relief in my chest there was an anger in my gut. It had started a spark, but over the length of our trek back through the woods had grown into a steady flame. I met my sister's eyes over our father's shoulder, and a chill ran through me. If my anger was a flame, then hers was the dead cold of darkest winter. Our father explained that our stepmother had been stricken ill, not long after we left. She was in her room now, asleep, and had been for days. He did not expect her to recover, though he had been following the physician's orders as best he could. Perhaps she shall rally to see you, he offered us hopefully. When neither of us answered, he sighed and dragged a hand down his thick beard. There was more gray in it than I remembered. I know you must be angry with me, with us, he told us wretchedly, that I could lose track of you so easily. It is an unforgivable failing in a father. Lost. I started slightly at the sharp edge in my sister's voice. Our father did too. She had always had a soft voice to match her heart. We were lost? She repeated. Staring at him intently, our father stared back, eyes wide with a hint of fear. Lost? He confirmed at last in little more than a whisper. I dropped my eyes, unable to continue looking at him. My sister did not. Abruptly, she stood from our small table. We will go see her, then. I blinked, startled both by the sudden movement and the conviction in her voice, but I followed her into our stepmother's sick room. That flame of rage flickered a little higher in my chest, and I found that I could not make myself move more than 2 steps inside the door. My sister knelt beside the hateful woman, and smoothed a hand over her brow in a gesture so tender it made me want to break something. Here. She tipped one of the witch's vials against her lips. This will help. I almost reached out to stop her, but as though she sensed the movement, she held a staying hand back toward me. When the vial was empty, she stood and brushed her hands down the front of her skirt. She did not look at me as she left the room. I hesitated a moment longer behind her, staring at the woman who had left us to the wood and the wild. Already her breathing seemed easier. Anger and love for my sister Ward, twin flames in the center of my chest. She had always borne such a soft heart. Our stepmother was awake and lively within a day. Though shocked by our return, she was mollified enough by the offerings of treasure we had stolen away with that she simpered and even summoned up some mawkish tears through which to tell us she was so sorry we had been lost to the wood. My rage burned hotter, and my sister grew colder. We should celebrate your return, our stepmother exclaimed, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders but no other sign of her illness remaining. What do you wish for supper, my darlings? Sweetbread. I jerked around to stare at my sister, eyes wide and mouth agape. She did not so much as glance at me, but I felt her hand take mine under the table. She smiled at our stepmother, and my throat went dry. But you are still recovering, stepmother. I feel quite well, all things considered. I shall make it, she offered gently. I could have stopped her then, could have clutched her hand in mine and dragged us out. We could have taken the treasure and left. It had been foolish of me to think there was nowhere for us to go. We might go anywhere. Seeing our father again, hearing him refuse to admit what they had done, made me sure of that. But my sister looked at me, just for a moment, and the ice in her gaze froze me to my chair. She was not looking for permission, but I nodded shakily anyway. Our stepmother exclaimed what a good, kind girl she was as she moved into the kitchen. Soon enough, the cloying smell of the baking sweetbread hung thick in the air. It was all I could do not to gag. My sister served the plates while the bread was still steaming gently, even drizzling the last of our honey stores over our parents' portions. We can always get more at the market now, she said with a hollow little laugh. Our stepmother agreed happily, though our father hesitated a moment before doing so himself. He was watching my sister with a faint wariness as she took her seat beside me. Go on, then, let us eat. They did. We sat in silence. Took our stepmother first. A faint cough, a furrow in her brow. She looked up with confusion, which changed quickly to a horrified realization as she stared at my sister. "You!" Our father choked, red spattering his lips. I looked away, squeezing my sister's hand tight where she had once more taken it beneath the table. We were desperate," he strangled out, reaching for her pleadingly. "I did not want to. She made me." My sister shook her head. "You let her." He collapsed forward onto the table, his breath a wheezing rattle that grew fainter with each passing moment. Our stepmother tried to lunge for us, but her legs gave out and she sprawled across the floor. A scarlet trail, like candied jam, trickled from the corner of her mouth. "You?" she gasped again, glaring balefully up at my sister. "You, little witch." They both began to convulse. I buried my face in my sister's shoulder. I could feel her stroking my hair even without raising my head. I knew she did not look away until their last breaths had faded into silence. Then she simply stood, her hand still in mine. We were both silent as we gathered up our bags still unpacked by the front door and stepped out into the cool evening. "You are afraid." I swallowed. "Why, yes." She smiled at me, squeezed my hand again, and all I felt was cold. "You do not need to be. I will protect you." My sister has always had a soft heart, soft as poisoned sweetbread. Siobhan awoke to the Irish sun spilling in the open doorframe of their single-room cottage. Her back pressed against Sean's, and she moved carefully so as to not wake him on his day-off morning duties. Today, she would feed the cattle and chickens. She rolled over, a stray mattress feather poking her side, and saw Aoife's small body in her basket, enveloped by a blanket. A surge in Siobhan's chest shot her awake. Aoife hadn't cried once through the night. Siobhan scrambled to her feet, bare soles pressed into the cool packed dirt, no longer minding waking Sean. Aoife was still breathing gently, though not stirring from her slumber. The night before, Siobhan and Sean had broken many unforetold rules. They left their beautiful blonde-haired, blue-eyed baby directly across an open door, ripe for the taking. The child was decorated with no red berries from rowan trees, nor garlands woven of daisies. Most egregious, they left no pail of buttermilk outside their front door on the Feast of the Assumption. Though she was breathing, something had to be wrong. Aoife usually had Siobhan up half the night. Was it too soon for her to be starving? The rhythm of Aoife's tiny chest rising and falling didn't convince Siobhan that she would actually wake up. So, Siobhan was about to break another rule: she would wake a sleeping baby. "Aoife, re hungry?" She hooked her index finger and dragged it across the infant's smooth forehead. Aoife hammered her wrinkled fists and wailed powerfully, unweakened by her empty stomach, to Siobhan's relief. Sean woke to the supernaturally shrill cries, groaned, and pulled on his boots. "Sorry, dear." Siobhan scooped the wriggling babe into her arms. "I've to feed Aoife, then I'll go out." "I'm already up," Sean grumbled. He lit the hearth in the middle of the room and warmed his palms. "Fine. After she's fed, I'll get on the oatcakes." Aoife refused to latch and continued screeching. She had fallen asleep somewhere else, where her name wasn't Aoife. Held by her mother, snuggled into her skin, the color of honey, but slightly more transparent. This woman wasn't her mother. Dressed in rags and a stained fichu, with strings of mousy hair tumbling out of a crushed bonnet. And she only had 2 eyes, neither of which were solid black and flecked with gold. Siobhan softly sang Tuare Lural and petted Aoife's peach fuzz head. She stopped crying and looked around the room with wide, dark eyes. Darker than before, Siobhan would have sworn. "Sean." Siobhan caught him in the doorway. "I'm worried about Aoife." She continued to worry about Aoife, who grew into the most peculiar child. At 2 years, Aoife hadn't started speaking. Siobhan would hold up and name a brooch, a comb, a spindle, prompting Aoife to parrot. But she wouldn't. Maybe a gurgle or babble. Siobhan knew the girl could hear because she calmed at lullabies, and was unsettlingly attentive to the noises and space around her. Then, one day, Aoife looked up and asked, "May I please have a cup of milk, ma'am?" And she spoke in no less than full sentences from that day forth. As she got older, she came to possess a strange knowledge that no child should have. However, it was often so strange that the adults around her couldn't notice. Like how Aoife's favorite chicken, Goldie, to whom she felt a special connection and shared all of her secrets, had the same birthday as her. When collecting stones by the river, she would always grab the oldest one, and when gathering eggs for breakfast, she'd pick the ones with the richest yolks. She disliked being touched and refused to hug her parents. She played alone, running around the farm collecting textured and striped rocks, or other little treasures like pine cones and the spiny burrs of horse chestnuts. She'd dump her collections on the floor, to Siobhan's dismay, exasperated at having to step over the mess, and sort them into piles based on size, then shape, then color. "Aoife," Siobhan said, stopping Aoife in her tracks, who was carrying around Goldie's eggs in her frock like she could incubate and hatch them. "You either need to put on your coat or come inside." No, the raw wool rubbed against Aoife's skin like steel. She preferred the cool air pricking it numb. It was still too warm for Aoife to freeze. She was stubborn, but not an actual problem, Siobhan thought. The youngest needed to be fed, and she needed to darn the hole in Sean's kirtle, and she needed to apply hemlock to her aching knees. Siobhan didn't have the energy to argue with her defiant child. Siobhan largely stopped trying to correct Aoife's behaviors and let her live off in her isolated dreamland. Off away from them. It was easier than putting up with her. Siobhan only had to make sure she was eating and had a place to sleep. And though they didn't know where she went during the day, what little adventures she'd go on, she was always back by supper. But then supper became an issue too. Alongside a hearty slice of brown bread, Siobhan ladled out the pottage, which had been brewing over its permanent home on the hearth, sprinkled with that day's leftovers of stewing beef, pearl barley, and peas. However, the carrots got added too late in the day. Their texture was wrong. The chunks grated against Aoife's tongue like sandpaper, and she refused to eat it. Sean told Aoife that she was not allowed to get up until she finished. Siobhan and Sean finished their meals. The three littles, all still blonde, as their hair hadn't turned brunette after the first cut like Aoife's, lapped up their meals and fell asleep in a pile. Aoife stubbornly sat there all night, in a sliver of moonlight sneaking in the doorframe. To appease her protesting stomach, she meticulously picked out every piece of carrot, then sopped up the remaining. Pottage with bread. In the morning, Siobhan saw Aoife sleeping sat upright, slumped over a pile of soggy carrots arranged in a pyramid on the floor. "Aoife," the girl nodded awake. "Ye didn't finish, ingrate. What's this wastin' food?" Siobhan pointed to the dirt-caked carrot chunks. "I'll give it to Goldie." "No. You're stayin' in today, till ye learn to do what you're told." Aoife, still on the floor, drew her legs up in on herself, hugged around her legs, and began rocking. "Knock it off, Aoife. Look at me." The girl still silently stared off and continued rocking. She could hear everything all at once. Gusts rustling the thatched roof, her father's fingers impatiently tapping his crossed arms, giggles and whispers of the littles gathered round, astonished at their mother's volume and stern tone. "Aoife." Siobhan's yell shot straight through Aoife's ears and lodged itself like an ice pick in her brain. Aoife screamed at the top of her lungs, that inhuman, supernaturally shrill shriek that they hadn't heard since she was a baby. Then it was silent. The whole family circled around to watch Aoife beat her small body with her own fists. Somewhere outside, a chaffinch chirped. The meltdown worried Siobhan. This was more than simple defiance. None of the other kids ever gave her so much trouble. Oisin, 2 years younger than Aoife, was already starting to help on the farm. None of them ever refused supper, and definitely none of them ever shrieked like that. This went beyond throwing a hissy fit to get what she wanted. There was something wrong with the child. Siobhan shuddered. The next Sunday after Mass, Siobhan sought out Kalia, the eldest woman of the village. Ringed in frizzled silver curls, the woman wore a black bombazine and had one eye blotted with icy white. Siobhan attempted to explain some of her concerns, seeking wisdom and guidance. She stopped talking at all, mad as a box of frogs. "Sounds like fairies," Kalia said. "They steal children and replace them with one of their own. peculiar lot, plagued with megrims. Siobhan thought back to when she first noticed Aoife's eyes change color. The first time she'd heard that terrible scream. She baptized. Of course, at 6 months. That usually prevents it. Must have already been too late. But that was so long ago. Could Aoife have been some other child this whole time? Siobhan wiped her clammy forehead. She searched her memories for another crux, but nothing stood out. Aoife was always utterly odd. She's your first eye? New mothers are most at risk. The in-between leaves you vulnerable. Should have baptized her sooner. You don't need to rabbit on about me blunders. Tell me how to fix it. Couple of different ways, confuse it, torture it. Get it to reveal itself and flee. Then they'll return your baby. Torture it. How do I confuse her? The next day, Aoife came home from playing, frock full of conkers and eggs, to find her mother doing the most unusual thing. Sipping tea out the bottom half of an eggshell. Siobhan had a few more emptied shells on the counter. Seeing Aoife walk in the door, she offered one out to her. Aoife took the unreasonably tiny vessel. Siobhan filled the shell with a pinch of fragrant leaves. Aoife was indeed confused, though her face remained stony. Still, no words passed through her. She spun the egg around to try to identify the least spiky part to raise to her lips. Ye enjoying your tea? Siobhan searched her daughter's dead face for signs of change. Aoife slowly nodded. Perhaps this was her mother's way of making a peace offering. An apology of sorts, though she couldn't make sense of it. She tediously curled the corners of her mouth into a smile. What's all this then? Siobhan sighed, gesturing to the lumpy skirt Aoife single-handedly held up like a basket. Of course, Siobhan thought, she could not do anything that would confuse this strange creature. Finally, the hint of an expression, as Aoife's eyebrows wiggled with excitement. She dumped her treasures out and chestnuts rolled across the floor. Aoife beamed with pride. Siobhan watched the scattering mess. The eggshell cracked between her fingers, dripping a single drop of weak tea. Clean it up, she said through pursed lips, scooped all the eggshells off the table, and left to go add them to the chicken feed. Siobhan grew less and less patient with Aoife, snapping and yelling at her more frequently. Aoife fell deeper into her silence and solemnness. She no longer even whispered to Goldie, but spent much more time hugging her and stroking her feathers. Siobhan would add carrots and other ingredients to the pottage late in the day intentionally, even though it surely tasted worse. Did she do it simply to spite Aoife? If she kept pushing, perhaps Aoife would be forced to snap out of it and eat the hard carrots and act like a normal kid. Torture it. Kalia suggested all sorts of horrors. Beating it with a stick, drowning it. The fairy child wouldn't tolerate the abuse, and would drop the act and run away. Siobhan just wanted her child back. She went with what she believed to be the least cruel option. Starving. It would be slower, give it a chance to give up at the pangs of hunger, before any real damage was done. Siobhan tried searching Aoife's eyes to see if she was still in there, but Aoife wouldn't look at her. Even when Siobhan grabbed Aoife by the sides of the face and forced eye contact, it still felt like Aoife was looking somewhere far off, looking straight through Siobhan, and it sent chills through her. Aoife thinned. Siobhan grew more definitive in her resolve, repeating to herself every day, every meal, that she was doing the right thing. His body grew frilier. What it deserved, for stealing her sweet daughter away from her. Siobhan wasn't even cruel necessarily. All it had to do was leave and bring Aoife back. By choosing to stay, it was choosing to starve. It wouldn't be able to put up with it much longer, Siobhan was certain. Except it did. It kept on living, growing bonier, with a swollen face and cracked lips, with a more somber disposition. With movements like a somnambulist, the girl slowed, careful not to too harshly shake the eggs in her frock. Every night Siobhan was kept awake imagining what had happened to Aoife. Where was she taken? What were the Fae doing to her? Was she safe? Being hurt? The old woman had told her. If tempting the changeling to reveal itself doesn't work, then it needs to be forced out. She decided her willingness to try more extreme measures. This thing had her child. She needed her back. Siobhan took Aoife to the elder's home. A small beehive of stone stuck awkwardly out the side of a knoll. Soft brome sprouted high around it. "Kalia," Sayaban called. The old woman pushed aside the sheet of heavy linen hung in the doorframe. No more than an inch, her fingers curling around the fabric. Her soul pigmented. I inspected the visitors, and she cocked a single brow. "It won't go." Siobhan's gaze flickered toward the dying child. "You've finally decided?" Kalia didn't pull the fabric back any further, but leaned forward to stick her nose out the gap. "Doesn't usually take parents this long, but they usually notice something's wrong a lot sooner." "You're sure it'll work? Rid you of the changeling at least. Flames'll force it to dance up out the chimney." Her gray curls bobbed with her jittery twitches. "If your girls survived the other realm, she'll be returned tonight." Siobhan stopped clawing into the child's shoulders and spun it around. Siobhan tried to catch the creature's large, dark eyes, but couldn't. They seemed to be looking somewhere far off as usual. Aoife was truly gone. Aoife wondered why she and her mother were here, and what a changeling was. Questions bubbled up in her throat, but she still couldn't get herself to speak. Imagining herself speaking, her mother's angry reactions and yelling, made her flinch. She squinted and tried to shake the thoughts out of her head. "Nervous, are ya?" The old woman leaned in close to Aoife and grinned devilishly. The child winced at the sudden lack of personal space and the smell of rotting teeth. "Do I have to be here for you to do it?" Siobhan released her grip on Aoife. "No." Kalia cupped Aoife's chin and whispered, "It's time for you to go." The two disappeared behind the linen. A gentle breeze whispered through the tall grasses and tousled the strands of mousy hair escaping Siobhan's bonnet. She stood there for a long time before turning to leave, to return to Sean, to her 3 beautiful children. The following transmission was recovered from the Ulysses starship. The first of its class starship capable of reaching farther reaches in space, equipped with ion engines, self-sustaining life support system and hibernation chambers able to keep an individual in stasis over long voyages. In the event of a mission-critical emergency, the captain will be woken from stasis to triage the problem. Captain's log. This is Captain Archibald Tell of the starship Ulysses, commissioned by the New World Exploration Alliance. Our mission states we are to reach orbit of the Saturn moon Europa and attempt a landing excursion. Initial navigation readout has us dramatically off course and exact position is unknown. The approximate date is 2316.8. Myself along with my crew have been in hibernation for 2 years 7 months 16 days into a 4-year journey. However, 20 minutes ago I was woken up while my crew stay asleep. Mission protocol states that the captain is to be brought out of hibernation if a life-threatening situation should occur. Currently I am in my stateroom, recording this message. The rest stay in hibernation. After completing the formalities associated with waking up from a 31-month sleep, I have been reviewing the latest auto logs. It appears a malfunction in the life support system has triggered the alarm and my subsequent wake from deep sleep. I may be a bit groggy and this freeze-dried coffee we get up here isn't doing me any favors. I have reset the alarm system but they continue to go off. I am running a diagnostic on the life support systems to find the problem. The initial message was an error number 16, which means we are dangerously low on oxygen. Just under 18 hours until depletion of reserves according to the readout. My first reaction is this is an error in the error messaging system as this ship, as far as I can understand the science, is designed to produce its own oxygen so there should never be a shortage. The life support system is equipped with CO2 scrubbers and what I can only understand it to be a recycling type of mechanism that creates oxygen. We also have reserve tanks as well as a separate lines feeding the pods in hibernation chamber. As soon as the diagnostics come back clean and I reset the alarms, I will put myself back to sleep. End transmission 17 hours 11 minutes and 5 seconds remaining. Diagnostics came back and confirming the error message. The ship is not only losing oxygen but also incapable of scrubbing the air of C02. Luckily, I'm the only one expelling any of it. The other 5 members of the crew are still in hibernations and they operate on a different air filtration system to better control their sleep. However, if the ship loses all its oxygen, they too will eventually lose it. I find this hard to believe. There has to be problem elsewhere causing this. Something smaller I've overlooked prompting these error messages. We triple-checked everything before we took off. I checked life supports myself. There's no way life support is failing. I'm going to reboot each system one by one and find the problem. This has to be a computing error that can be straightened out with a reboot. On a more personal note, this coffee is shit and is doing nothing for my emotional state right now. What I wouldn't give for an actual espresso up here. End of transmission 14 hours, 7 minutes and 53 seconds remaining. Well, I've been through each system on this ship. Run diagnostic on almost every line of code. And it's all running optimally, that is except for the life support. The goddamn life support. The circuit board on the oxygen rebreathing system malfunctioned and the filtration system shut down. This happened shortly after we went into hibernation. We slowly ate up the oxygen over the course of 2 years. And I just wasted 3 hours fucking around with the computer. Not that I could really do much else up here. I don't have many other options. But I have had time to think this all through. This whole mission felt suspect from the beginning. Thinking back now, from getting this assignment to launch was like 6 weeks. Not too short of time, but still probably could have used another month or so in the simulators. I mean, this was all new tech we were playing around with. But still, I have flown on 12 missions to the Moon and Mars orbit. I have a feel for how this is supposed to go. The proper timelines and procedures. And something smelled like shit from the get-go on this one. Why did we rush this mission? We knew the ship wasn't ready. My reports stated as much. The Alliance. Those bastards rushed us. Through the tests. Hell, even fudged the numbers on 1 or 2. Oh yeah, I know all about that. And for what? Just so big-time CEOs Agatha and Ernesto can beat the other guys to punch. This is just a fucking game to them. I never trusted them. Are we just an insurance write-off for those sons of bitches? It's been all about the ship anyway and the engines and how it can revolutionize space travel. Well, now that ship is lost. And us? Our lives are expendable. What's it matter to them if we run out of oxygen just so long as the fucking ship makes it? Well, guess what? It's going straight to hell with me. Maybe you just use robots next time. Fuck. What the fuck am I going to do? Okay, think. If I rear out power from the backup generators, I could maybe restart the system. It's a long shot, but it's a plan. I'm not beat yet. I have less than 15 hours of air left, but I'll use every second fighting. 'Cause fuck them. End of transmission 8 hours, 48 minutes and 17 seconds. I've rerouted. I've rewired. I've re-engineered. Reverse engineered. Rebuilt. Reformatted. Deformatted. And retooled. Done everything in the manual and anything else that seemed plausible. I am all out of ideas, plans, maneuvers, and options. Except for one thing, it's not a viable option though, but it's possible. Oh, I shouldn't even be thinking of it. It's wrong, it's deceitful, but it might work. It would require borrowing the power and oxygen from the hibernation system. It would only supply enough power and oxygen for one person to make it back home. I shouldn't even be thinking this. The captain goes down with his ship. But I really never got be a captain. I have so much more to give and offer space exploration. 12 missions, but this was my first one at the helm. 20 years in spaceflight and I am now a captain. I can't give that up now, just when I am about to get started. I could honor the crew's sacrifice by continuing on. I could get back on track. Find out where I am. Make it to Saturn and back. Landing seems out of the question, but a manned orbit of Saturn is worth it, worth them. This could work, right? Yeah. Oh, what the hell? What the hell am I thinking? I've just gone crazy, that's all. There's no cheating this. I just wasted 5 hours of air. 5 hours of my life. I never thought the idea of wasting breath ever meant so much, but when you have so little left, well, I feel guilty watching the clock, holding my breath, my life ticking away one Mississippi after another. I try as I might to slow down time, draw every second out as long as possible. End of transmission 1 hour 49 minutes and 12 seconds, remaining Commander Tracy Wilcox, Lieutenant Benjamin Smiley, Dr. Reese Park, Dr. Davis Hampton, First Engineer Oscar Marquez. These are the names that should be remembered. And I, Captain Archibald Tell, deliver here my final transmission. We, the crew of the Ulysses, should forever be remembered for being the first of our tribe to go farther from the cave than ever before, to venture beyond the known and to make our mark on the universe. To plant a flag on another world and say, "Hello, galaxy. Humans are here." But no, I guess it just wasn't our turn. The 6 of us were just meant to be casualties in this new space race. Just names entered into a log labeled failed. Missions. They were better than that. They were a damn fine crew, and I would have been honored to serve alongside them. I thought about waking them, but for what? Wake them up just to tell them they'll be dead in 2 hours. No, let them sleep. Let them die while dreaming. I'll be joining after this transmission, climbing back in my pod, to die peacefully. I wonder if you die in the middle of a dream, can your soul get stuck there for all eternity? Hopefully it's a pleasant one. I've uploaded videos our families sent up to each of the pods. Maybe hearing the voices of our families will put them in our dreams. And then we can be there with them forever. It's about the only optimism I can find right about now. I have approximately 1 hour and 49 minutes of oxygen left. 109 minutes. Would it be worth using any of 6,540 seconds lamenting my failures and regrets? How this mission failure is the crowning achievement to a life fraught with ineptitudes and fuck-ups. No, why give myself the satisfaction of dying miserable? If ever a person were meant to be floating lifelessly through the universe for all eternity, it would be Archibald Tell. Always late to the party, last picked for the game, just short of the mark. But this mission was supposed to change all that. This mission was to put my name in the mouths of everyone worldwide. The hero of the great Saturn exploration. Some hero. I couldn't even sleep properly without killing everyone. Now I'll forever be known as the captain of the death ship, piloting a crew of corpses across the stars. What a joke this has been. I'll conclude my final entry with a message for who or whatever finds us. We are humans, we are curious, we are ambitious, we exceed every boundary. We cross every line. We are intelligent, inquisitive, indulgent. We seek that which is lost and explore that which is unknown. We are prideful, we are dedicated, and we are stubborn. Most of all, we are human. Full of faults, but give us time and we will show you love. End of official transmissions, begin private transmission. Elise, my love, not sure if this will even get to you or when, if ever that will be. But by that time I will be dead. At this moment, I have about 68 minutes left. Always imagined I'd be scared, and I want to be scared, but I can't. I can't feel anything. It's funny how being this close to death and I can't find emotion. I feel numb to it all. All my life I've feared this moment. Always anxious it would happen too soon. At a point when I hadn't experienced much of the universe. But I've come to understand something about death. There is nothing to fear. Because what we fear in life are the consequences to actions. But there are no consequences with death, because death is the final consequence. Seeing you one last time would be my last request. I was foolish for leaving you for this. My ambition to succeed blinded me to the achievements I already had. You and Grace and Max. I can see their faces when they find out their daddy's gone forever. I shed a tear for that. For them. For you. Leaving for 8 years was heartbreaking enough and has turned out be a huge mistake. I should have listened to you. You knew this was a bad play. You were always the smart one. So smart, funny, quirky and clumsy, beautiful. So endlessly beautiful. If there is a place beyond this, I will miss you and love you eternally. But I ask one thing of you. Please accept this as I have and please move on with your life. I will forever be your love in the stars. But you deserve love on the ground as well. And Grace and Max, I want you to grow up to be the best and brightest, most amazing people that I know you are capable of becoming. Because you two are the most perfect, most beautiful creatures, and I was stupid fool to ever leave you. To ever think I needed something more than the love from you two. I want you to know that you will never be alone. Okay. As long as the stars come out, your daddy will be right up there looking down on you. Always with you, always loving you. The ocean is as beautiful as she is vast. And with that, she is full of terrors. Arvid looked down at the tarnished heirloom in his muddied palm, the arrow shaking before landing west. The scent of brine coated the air, and the sensation of salty droplets kissing his cheeks brought him back to the world around him. It had been ages since he had gone out to sea, not since. No, he still could not think of it. He once thought that there was not one thing that could bring him back to the water. Not even his oldest companion Baylor had been able to convince him to return over all the years. Until now. At the sound of boots scraping across sand and pebbles, Arvid glanced to the side just enough to catch the sight of one of Baylor's crew. "Baylor wants us at the Sugar Plum," the young man informed him before walking off, his accent heavy and tangled. Arvid answered with a silent nod, glancing at his compass one more time before shutting it with a flick of his wrist and tucking it away in his pocket. Star operator, the Sugar Plum was a delicate bakery and confectionery in the middle of the village Arvid could not remember the name of for the life of him. The scent of sugar and warmth hit him and went right to his aching gut the second he walked in. How long had it been since he last ate? An elderly woman behind the counter glanced up at him, her eyes roaming over him. Nora. He had never met her before, but he knew of her. She had taken care of Baylor during a particularly low point in his life a few years ago, becoming a sort of mother figure for the man. Then more literally when he married her daughter Aoife. "You lookin' for something, dearie?" Arvid's mouth corked up into a slight smile on one side. "Do you only sell sweets? I'm craving a bit of salt." The woman returned his smile at those words, leaving a rag on the countertop as she guided him to the kitchen. It was late enough in the day that anyone employed by the woman was long gone, although he was sure it was just her and her daughter. "I'm Nora," she said now. "You don't look familiar. Are you usually with Bally?" Bally. Arvid wanted to laugh. There was no way anyone else could ever get away with calling the captain such an endearing name. Not for a long time. She hummed in thought as she reached a pantry door, looking him over again. There was a sullen, languid looseness to his features and his gait that made it more than obvious that he would not be having his first drink of the day downstairs. "From the looks of you, I'd say you're all set for the night," she teased playfully, and when Arvid's attempt at a light-hearted smile ended up being a mere twitch, her expression hardened slightly. Nora opened the door, pointing inside. Towards the back, there are some shelves with bags of flour. Beside them is a wee door down to the basement. Then she added before he could even take so much as a single step, "It is understood that I and my belongings are to be left alone. You are welcome to have your drink and have your fun. But if I catch even a whiff of brawling or any other nonsense, you're out on your bottom." Arvid couldn't help but let out a laugh. "Is there a problem with that? If there is, you can turn yourself right back around." He shook his head, amusement still on his features. "Why would you take in a lot like us and think there'll be no trouble?" Nora straightened out her posture, the wrinkles in her face soft like dough as she smiled. "'Cause Bally loves his men, but he loves me more." Star operator, had it not been for the alcohol already warming him and easing his mind, Arvid likely would have felt a bit more churning in his gut at the sight of all the men bonded together by so many travels. Despite his connection to Baylor, he felt like an intruder. Their energy filled the rather generous basement with its large cherrywood table and a small bar in the corner. Some of Baylor's weapons adorned the walls as decor, any that he associated with journeys or battles so magnificent that he'd rather treat them like a piece of history. The only weapon he never parted from in all his years was the whetted rapier that hung at his side. Boisterous profanity and laughter caught his attention as he sat in a chair, attempting to slide into it smoothly but instead landing hard and slamming his back against it. Thankfully, all those around him were far too distracted to notice his pathetic entrance. "I don't believe one word," Arvid heard one of the men bark after a hearty gulp of his drink. If he remembered correctly, it was Baylor's latest onboard carpenter. "You don't have to believe it. It still happened," Baylor said smoothly, before murmuring something soft to his wife as she brought him another drink and settled herself in his lap. She truly was stunning, in a way that was gentle and kind, like warm, clear weather. "No one survives such a reckless encounter with sirens." The seaman who had spoken to Arvid earlier chimed in. "Well, I'm not just anyone now, am I?" "Oh, please," Aoife laughed, causing his men to join in. Baylor looked up at her fondly. "Well, be rest assured that you don't have to worry about his confidence in himself and this journey, gentlemen." "What happened?" Arvid asked now, bringing the attention of the whole group onto him. Most of them appraised him with muted or warning expressions but stayed still as a large grin appeared on Baylor's face. And you said you would never. Hadn't been sure, but. Baylor laughed out, Aoife moving off of him for him to get up and clasp Arvid's hand before pulling him into a bear hug. Arvid never considered himself a small man by any means, but Baylor seemed to tower over everyone. His large frame full of muscle and heavy weight from years of indulging on drink and salted meats. Having the man's arms wrapped around someone meant to be engulfed, and to smell smoke and the salt of his sweat and the sea. I knew you would show. He heard his captain and closest friend whisper, keeping it between them. I'm a man of your word always. Baylor beamed as he pulled away, gesturing to his companion as he turned now to face his men. Men, I would like to formally introduce you to my old friend, Arvid, and the best artist we could ever ask for. An artist? One of the crew asked, likely a new member considering the youthfulness of his features and the naivete of his question. He work with paints or something? No, you fool. The carpenter was speaking up as others laughed and nudged the young man. He is our new sailing master, Baylor clarified. Plenty of men sobered at that like it was expected, but a harsh reminder that their old navigator was gone. Arvid could guess that he was well loved and respected amongst those who knew him, and perhaps Baylor had even told him, but he forgot. He forgets a lot of things these days. Around then Aoife returned. Arvid had not even realized she had gone after moving off of her husband, and gently handed a mug to him. She offered him an encouraging smile, nodding at Arvid's quiet thanks. If he's so good, why's he not worked with us before? A voice chimed in, followed by some mumblings of agreement. He was always on my journeys before I met you fine men, Baylor answered, his features becoming sharpened with seriousness. Before the gully of blood. Something soured within Arvid at the mention, despite having known that the topic would come up. Legends had already formed about the battle that he had been involved in back when he was only 18 years old. The sort of legends that resulted in its name claiming that the skirmish had gotten so horrific that the bloodshed alone dug a new gully into the nearby land. Simple lies by locals to make others gasp and eyes widen. The horror and bloodshed, yes, but he hated that it was turning into a tale. It made the day that tore his entire life apart into a mere story. But at least the fellow men recognized what that battle had really been, and what it meant that he had gone through it and survived, and their questioning ceased. Instead, they gaped at him or their eyes remained turned down onto their drinks. What was his name? Your sailing master? Arvid asked now after clearing his throat, so aware of Baylor's heavy arm still slung across his shoulders. The bare paw of a hand gave him a subtle squeeze. Conall? A man spoke up, grief lacing his tone. A cook, Arvid guessed, considering his missing arm. To Conall? Arvid raised his cup before taking a solid swig of his drink, the others following suit. Star operator as the night passed. Arvid grew more comfortable with his surrounding company who successfully pulled genuine smiles and laughter from him. However, he still tried to remain in the background as much as possible. He was an observer and a listener if nothing else. It was part of why he was so good at navigating and likely why he and Baylor got along so well. The captain was always the one to talk, seeking out listening ears, but while he loved the amusement of those who gave such potent reactions to his stories, he valued Arvid's presence the most because it has proven time and time again to never be temporary. So, what happened? What about sirens? Arvid asked now, speaking up for the first time in probably a half hour. Absolutely nothing, he's full of it. One of the crew, Luff, chimed in with a laugh as he jutted his thumb in Baylor's direction. Have I never told you about the siren of the southern waters? One of the men muttered something about, here he goes again. Arvid shrugged, responding that he did not believe so. Baylor let out a long breath, one of his hands settling on his gut. It was 5 years ago, he started, still getting a few snickers from his usual dramatics. I had a full crew, even some artists such as yourself and Maddock. He nodded to the carpenter. Had even afforded a doctor, not that it mattered. He laughed sardonically. He was the first one to die. The rest followed. He paused, a seasoned storyteller watching this information sink in. We were sent out to hunt the sirens. The man offering payment had lost a son to the seas around the area, and a cunning woman told him his son had been bewitched and torn apart by sirens. He wanted every last one dead, and he was ready to provide a hearty tip if we brought the bodies, so he could hang their bust up onto his wall like prize bucks. It has been done before over the centuries, but it is rare. Not many survive interactions with the creatures. And you did? One of the men asked in disbelief. Baylor's usual humor seemed to have been completely drained of him as he looked at the man. Yes, he responded flatly. We were able to kill all but one. Kept ourselves safe by putting wax in our ears. But she was enraged. She dropped all of her usual tricks and got as brutal as those beings truly are. Hard to believe that when you're still here, Maddock argued, arms crossed over his chest. That's because I saved her. And now, I am asking you men to join me in finishing the job. Arvid glanced around as the crew was in uproar with accusations and questions. They wanted to know how and why he had supposedly saved a siren, and if so, why kill her now? Why tell them now? As usual, Baylor's closest companion was silent, observing all those around him, but even his own frustrations and questions rose to the surface. With everything that has happened to him, the men he had been with before the battle, why risk our lives for one siren? They hunt in packs. If she is alone, she's harmless. Probably dead. Arvid noticed the way Baylor's knuckles blanched around his mug's handle, bringing it up to his lips as he held his gaze. He placed it back down with a thump. A fisherman went missing last summer, and when his remains were found, all signs pointed towards a siren. I figured you all would appreciate being spared the details, but, darling, Aoife whispered, the color gone from her complexion, which gave Baylor pause. Her face seemed to draw him back from his memories and ground him again, his gaze going to Arvid. How can we trust you? The cook asked boldly, weathered and harmed and not much left to lose. Baylor was building up to confront him for doubting his own captain before he continued. Legend says that any man that escapes a siren's song remains obsessed with her forever. The captain bristled slightly before laughing. His gaze trailed from Arvid to Aoife now, his body settling again. He reached up a broad hand to brush her auburn hair back. Clearly, that's not true. Star operator, the journey itself had been going smoothly. Arvid, however, those first 2 weeks, the responsibility of guiding the ship and once again being on board another ship left him reclusive and sick, frequently vomiting off the side of the vessel.
Then the nightmares, the nightmares were horrific.
Filled with memories collaged with the faces of Baylor and his men. Then the anxieties around a potential confrontation with a siren, even alone, filled with such a vengeful rage towards men. Sometimes when he was planning with the current, the weather, and going over old charts, he considered providing the wrong instructions to Baylor or his helmsman, Angus. He would sit at his charts, nauseous and sleep-deprived, considering the repercussions on his relationship with Baylor to disobey his orders. Arvid went up onto the deck, his stomach turning and the taste of acid in the back of his throat again after doing so well the past few weeks. It was deep into the night, but the skies were clear, putting the bright stars on full display. The light from above glittered off the black waves, occasionally tilting the vessel one way then another as they moved along. He had sworn his stomach was about to lurch when he saw Baylor, his back towards him. Captain! Baylor turned, hand reaching for his rapier before his body went lax again with a light laugh. For once, the man was silent, though even as Arvid approached, both now leaning their forearms against the edge. If you are having second thoughts, Arvid started slowly, noticing the circles under his companion's eyes. Had he been missing as much sleep as him? No, I will see this to the end. Arvid nodded, sitting with the silence that was so unfamiliar with Baylor at his side. Are you? The navigator hesitated. No, Captain. Baylor huffed out a laugh. Be honest, and stop calling me Captain. It feels unnatural from you. Arvid snorted at that, nodding in understanding. I have had second thoughts the second I knew exactly what your plans were. He noticed the way the man beside him bristled but continued despite it. Considering what happened in these waters before, you must understand. It is not easy to lose your men. Baylor parted his lips, but Arvid did not let him interrupt. It was my fault my men died during the Gully of Blood. He practically spat the title that battle was given. I guided them to the wrong waters. Their blood is on my hands. And if you have brought me on this journey only to put me through it all over again, I swear. Swear what? Baylor challenged, moving from leaning against the edge to pulling himself back up to his full height. Arvid sighed, his gaze trailing up to his hard expression before returning to the waters. I could not handle it again. I have to avenge what happened to my men on that day. If this ends in losing all of our men, my men, it will be because of my demands, not yours. Silence fell between them again, and Arvid was beginning to taste acid again. We should be around those waters within a month, if the weather remains this steady, which I doubt. At that, Arvid turned to leave his companion until he heard Baylor break one of his own rules aboard this ship. He whistled. Softly, shakily, but he whistled. Arvid's blood turned to ice, feeling it was a call to something deep within the waters. And as that song called back to him, Aoife was back in the home she shared with Baylor when he was not out at sea. She went through his study, wishing to feel him, smell him, look at his writing, when she came across a journal bound in leather. It was sloppy with some pages half sticking out, and when she opened it she found drawings upon drawings and paintings of a red-haired woman, chest exposed and covered in scales. Frank and Natalie were about to turn the TV off for the evening, when a news flash alert came on, reading, "Attention. Due to blizzard, Riverville and all surrounding communities will experience a power outage, starting at 12 midnight. The news reporter appeared on camera, confirming the announcement and adding that it was unclear how long the power outage would last during the night, but everyone must take precautions during the stormy night. Frank shut the TV off and sighed in agony. He knew that little Charlie was afraid of the dark, so he wouldn't cope well with this. We'll all sleep together here in the living room, he said, so that Charlie and his sister don't get scared. Natalie nodded in agreement. I'm going to clean the baby up before we head to bed. It was 11:15, so only 45 minutes before the scheduled blackout. While Natalie was giving baby Alana a bath, Frank and 5-year-old Charlie were setting up the living room for a family sleepover in preparation for the blackout. Pretty soon, mother and daughter were ready and returned to the living room. Cranberry-scented candles surrounded the coffee table, lighting up the room, in addition to the Christmas tree lights. Imagine that, a snowstorm on the day after Christmas. At least the candles were useful for radiating light in the dark, besides just being a gift to Natalie from Frank. Within minutes, the 4 of them fell asleep, and it wasn't long until the clock struck midnight, and the whole town of Riverville experienced its first power outage from a storm. By the time Frank woke up the next morning, it was 6:50. He offered to look out the window to determine how much snow they'd gotten over the night, but when he opened the door, he was surprised to see there was no snow at all. Natalie watched him go outside to ask the other neighbors what happened, but he saw that everyone else was dressed strangely, wearing attire that only people from the 1950s would wear. Also, the whole neighborhood looked suburban, with houses looking vintage. Mr. Russell, who lived next door to Frank and Natalie, suddenly appeared to be a young boy, wearing black suspenders and a white t-shirt. When he smiled, he had a small gap in his teeth. He was tossing a football to his friends across the street. Those other boys appeared to be the same age and were not afraid to play on the streets. Frank exchanged baffled glances with Natalie as she came outside to also check what was happening, before Frank asked the young Russell, "Who are you? And who are all these kids? What happened to all the snow?" Young Russell grinned. "I'm James Russell, your next-door neighbor, of course. These kids are my friends from school. And what snow? Riverville hasn't had snow yet this winter season." One of Russell's friends called out to him from across, "Hey Jimmy, toss us that football already. Why don't ya? Hold your horses, Lionel." Russell shouted back at his friend, who groaned in impatience with the other young boys. He turned to Frank and Natalie and smiled. "Sorry about that. We were just tossing the ball around." "It's okay." Natalie smiled. "It's just, Everything looks so, what's the word? Different, Frank replied. Yeah. Different is an understatement. She looked down and noticed that she was wearing a black vintage dress with white polka dots and a white ribbon, along with black heels, while Frank was wearing a white dress shirt with a black tie and gray dress pants with black dress shoes. Frank's dark hair was neatly combed and parted to the left, which brought out the blue of his eyes. Natalie's long, dirty blonde hair was pulled back into a neat, high ponytail and a black hair ribbon that matched her dress and shoes. She was speechless as she glanced at her clothes, Frank's clothes, and the fact that their 80-something next-door neighbor Mr. Russell was now a young boy. She turned to Russell. I know this is a dumb question, Mr. Russell. That's Jimmy Russell to you. Russell grinned. James Russell, she said. Do you know where we are, exactly? This doesn't look like the Riverville that we remember. Oh, I grew up like this, and I remember Riverville like this, he said. That's where you are right now. But why does everything look so much like the 50s? Frank asked. Russell chuckled. That's because we are in the 50s. And I'm 12 and so are my friends up there. How old are you two? Natalie shook her head, partly in disbelief. A woman isn't allowed to reveal her age. It's okay, Frank replied. We're only 26. This is all new to us. What are we doing? In the 50s, exactly? And how did we get here? Russell gave them an incredulous look. You mean you don't know that you've always lived your lives like this? Are you from another planet? No, we're not, Frank said. Natalie and I are married, and we come from a time when cell phones existed. Wait! He frantically searched through his pants pockets, as if trying to see if his phone was there. Where is it? Where's what? Russell asked. My cell phone. Russell shrugged. We're living in 1954, sir. We don't have any cell phones or whatever the heck you just said. Those things didn't exist back then. Can I go back to playing with my friends now? Or do you have any more strange questions for me? I'm just a normal 12-year-old kid who can't answer all of your questions today. You're probably better off just reading about what your life is like in the 50s. I think if you read something, it'll tell you how to get back to your own time period. But for now, welcome to Riverville in the 50s. Natalie asked, but how did we get here in the first place? The last thing, Frank. And I remember, there was a snowstorm, then a blackout at some point during the night. Her eyes widened as she reached the inevitable conclusion. The snowstorm, it must have transported us back in time to the 1950s. Frank nodded, agreeing with her. What other logical conclusion could there be? But Russell shrugged again. That's possible. All we have to do is wait for another snowstorm to get here, and if it does, not sure when that'll be. I think it'll get you guys back to your own time period. But I think for now, you just have to stay stuck here. I don't know anything about time travel. I'm sorry, but I'm just a 12-year-old dumb kid. He gave them a gentle smile. Frank and Natalie realized that they ought to get used to seeing James Russell as a lively, free-spirited young boy instead of as the boring, often grumpy old man they already knew him as, living next door to him. They shook hands with him and thanked him for his time before he continued playing football with his friends. When Frank and Natalie returned inside, they realized that the TV in their living room disappeared. Apparently, in the 1950s, not every household owned a television set, only radio. So their only means of receiving news was through radio instead. Little Charlie stretched as he woke up, and baby Alana began fluttering open her eyes. Now that the kids were up, Natalie wasn't sure how to tell Charlie about the bizarre experience. Frank turned on the radio, but it only gave out static, indicating that it wasn't working. He groaned in frustration. Great. How are we supposed to find out where we are? I'm up, Charlie said as he walked up to Frank and gave him a hug. What's wrong, Daddy? I don't know, buddy, Frank said softly. Even Charlie had his hair parted to the right, just like other young boys during this time. His blue pajamas remained the same. I think we all need to take a quick little family trip around town. Charlie's eyes lit up as he jumped around. Oh boy, I'd really love that. That sounds real neat, Daddy. Natalie smiled. Real neat, Daddy? What kind of language are you picking up on, Charlie? She couldn't help but wonder if her 5-year-old son was starting to pick up on 1950s slang. Hopefully that wasn't a result of the time travel. Charlie shrugged innocently. Gee, I don't know, Mama. I'm so sorry. It's just the first words that came to my mind. Natalie caressed his hair. It's okay, sweetheart. Why don't you go up and get yourself cleaned up? Your father, sister, and I are planning to grab some breakfast somewhere around town. Oh yes, I'm starving, Charlie replied as he ran upstairs to take care of his morning routines. In the meantime, Natalie busied herself with taking care of the little girl, and Frank went through a phone book to search for some restaurants where the four of them could go out for breakfast, and in the process, try to get some answers as to how the snowstorm could have transported them back in time to the 1950s. Eventually, Frank found a restaurant where they could dine. Riverville's most popular diner, Sal's Diner, which opened up just 4 years earlier when the owner, Salvatore, was only 30. The restaurant still remained popular, even after his death years later. When the four of them got to Sal's, everything confirmed that they were living in 1954. The diner was packed, as it always was, even on the weekends. For teens, it was a popular hangout location where they could grab a soda or a milkshake, do homework and study with each other, all the great stuff. The waitress, Sharon, was assigned to serve Frank, Natalie, and the kids at the booth, which was located across from a booth of 5 teenage girls, gossiping and laughing loudly with each other. The overall loudness of the cafe drowned out the radio that was playing soft music in the background, along with small announcements at intervals that mostly had to do with Eisenhower's plans for the country. Frank wished they were sitting by the radio so that he could pick up on some news on how he, Natalie, and the children should return back to the 21st century. Pretty soon, they received their orders, and Sal, just as he'd always been known for doing, came to each customer's table to ask everyone about their overall service. It showed you how friendly he was toward his customers and how he made everyone feel like family. He came to Frank and Natalie's table, grinning at them as he asked, "So, how was your breakfast?" Frank and Natalie smiled as they each gave a thumbs up. "It was really keen, Sal," Natalie replied, trying her best to speak in 1950s slang. "Thank you for checking in on us." "No problem. It's what I do best." Sal gave them a wink. "We know," Frank smiled. "We've been here dozens of times, and we know your service very well." Sal smiled graciously. "Well, I don't know your names, but I'll let you know right now that my door is always open, so you all feel free to stop by whenever you want. I'll also be a listening ear whenever you need me." Natalie smiled. That was the Sal she and Frank knew, loved, and remembered so fondly. Then she cleared her throat, taking a chance by asking him the most important question. "Sal, would you mind giving us some directions to the public library?" "Of course," he replied instantly. "Just let me tend to a few more orders and I'll get back to you." "Thank you." Frank smiled. He and Natalie found it amazing that Sal didn't recognize them, but they certainly recognized him as a younger man during this time. Tall, thin, and attractive for a man of Italian ancestry. Everyone loved Sal, and it wasn't only because of his amazing restaurant business. He actually served in World War II, and to all the locals of Riverville, he was a community hero who fought for his country. That's the best way Frank and Natalie remembered him. He was their key hope in helping them get back to the future without interfering with past events that might impact their future. After he finished tending to his other customers, Sal came up to Frank and Natalie's table and gave them a piece of paper where he wrote out the directions to the Riverville Public Library. "Thank you very much," Frank said. "No problem." Sal smiled. "I hope you all stay safe on the road." "We will, thanks," Natalie said as she and Frank gathered the children as they exited the diner. Pretty soon, they arrived at the library, and Frank asked the young librarian, Jean, about books on time travel and space. She led them to the section, and Frank and Natalie began checking out books that pertained to time warps, time loops, and the like. After they found 2 books that piqued their interest, they checked them out and headed back home so they could read each book thoroughly for specific information on how one should return to their own time period without interfering with past events. But the books came up with nothing useful. Frank then turned on the radio, and suddenly, it was working properly again. The news announced that there was going to be a thunderstorm in the area later tonight at approximately 11:30, along with a warning of a possible blackout. Frank and Natalie listened in awe, realizing this was their only chance to get transported back into the 21st century. "We should certainly prepare for tonight," Natalie said, "just like we did for the snowstorm, and it brought us back in time." "Yeah, I'll start getting out all the candles when it's time," Frank said. "But for now, let's make the most of our time here. Let's have little Charlie play with the other kids and the baby with a babysitter. And you and I can mingle with other kids our age around town." Natalie smiled. "Sounds like a great idea." The young family spent the rest of the day interacting with the other neighbors, most of whom were dead by 2023. Little Charlie was at the playground, playing with other 5-year-olds on the swings and slides. Natalie dropped baby Alana off with a woman named Mrs. Beverly, who had 3 children of her own. Frank and Natalie spent the rest of the day exploring what the town looked like back in the 1950s, going to social clubs and events that catered to young adults such as themselves. By the time it was 8 o'clock, it was dark out and they knew it was time to return home so that the town could prepare for the incoming storm that evening. After completing all their nightly routines, Frank, Natalie, and the kids gathered in the living room, just as they had done the last time with the snowstorm. Only this time, it was a thunderstorm. The scented candles were placed around the coffee table to light up the room in case the power went out as predicted. And then the thunderstorm began, thunder booming loudly as rain poured down like a waterfall. The storm was peaceful enough to cause a power outage in Riverville at the designated time, 11:30. Hours later, Frank and Natalie woke up at 7:50. This time, things were different. Their TV set was back, and their cell phones were on the coffee table. That meant they were back to the future now. It's 2023 again. Frank got up to check the windows and saw that there was a thick blanket of snow on the ground, indicating that the snowstorm had taken place yesterday. It had stopped snowing now, but that was more than enough proof that they were no longer living in the 1950s. To their knowledge, Sal was long gone and Mr. Russell was back to being his old, 80-something grumpy self again. Not that same energetic little boy they'd seen him as, while in the time warp. Natalie gasped with awe. "So, are we back to our own time period now?" "Yeah." Frank nodded eagerly. "And I couldn't have been more relieved. Come look at all this snow." Natalie came over to check the snow. They saw that Mr. Russell, along with a few other neighbors, were up and about, trying to make their way through the snow by shoveling it out of their respective driveways. "Do you think we should give some of them a hand, babe?" she asked Frank. "We will." Frank held her hand. "As soon as we're done with our own morning routines. We want the kids to be up first." "Of course." She smiled, then she sighed with relief. "God, it feels so great to be back in 2023 again. I don't want to take anything for granted with you, Frank." She gave him a kiss on the cheek. "I love you so much." "I love you too, Natty," he said. Then they became caught up in a passionate moment with each other, Frank holding her in his arms, the same way he did on their wedding night 5 years ago. It felt like a long time since they said, "I do," but that moment was worth it. They traveled through time together with the kids, and they made it out safe and sound. Here's to hoping there would be a lifetime of more journeys ahead of them. The town of Willoughby slept under a blanket of twilight, its streets quiet but for the occasional chime of an unseen clock tower. It was a place caught in a perpetual dusk, where shadows stretched long and the air carried the faint scent of old books and candle wax. Through these shadowed streets walked a man named William Crow, his shoes worn thin and his purpose as faded as the name on the satchel he carried. William had arrived on a train he couldn't remember boarding. He had been searching, always searching, but the destination was unclear, even to himself. There was a feeling in his chest, like a clock wound too tightly, ticking down to something unnamed. The town of Twilight Willoughby was strange, as towns go. The buildings seemed older than they should have been, leaning slightly as if listening to secrets whispered by the wind. The people who wandered the streets, shopkeepers, schoolchildren, and men in wide-brimmed hats, moved with the unhurried grace of those who had no particular place to be. William stopped outside a shop with a wooden sign that read, "Clocks Repaired," Time lost, time found. The ticking inside was rhythmic, hypnotic. He pushed open the door, a bell, jingling softly above him. The clockmaker behind the counter stood an old man with wiry hair and spectacles that seemed to catch the glow of the dim gaslight. He was tinkering with a pocket watch, a magnifying lens perched on one eye. "Lost something, have you?" the man asked without looking up. "Excuse me," William replied. The clockmaker finally raised his gaze, his eyes the color of tarnished brass. "You're lost. That's why you're here. Everyone who walks through my door is." I don't think I am," William stammered. "I was just passing by." "Nobody passes by Willoughby," the clockmaker interrupted. He set down the watch, folded his hands, and leaned forward. "Tell me, Mr. Crow, what are you looking for?" William's heart skipped. "How do you know my name?" The clockmaker smiled faintly. "I know a great many things. I know you've been searching for something or someone for years. I know you feel like time has slipped through your fingers, like sand from a broken hourglass. Am I wrong?" William hesitated. "No," he admitted. "But how?" "Willoughby isn't just a place, Mr. Crow. It's a crossroads. People like you come here when they've lost their way, when they've forgotten what it is they're searching for. And sometimes, if they're ready, they find it." The offer the clockmaker reached beneath the counter and produced a small, ornate pocket watch. Its surface was engraved with swirling constellations and the faint outline of an hourglass. He held it out. "This is yours," the clockmaker said. "I've never seen that before," William replied, but his hand moved to take it. The moment his fingers brushed the metal, he felt a jolt, a memory, sharp and vivid. The forgotten memory he was sitting on a park bench years ago. A boy with curly hair sat beside him, clutching a wooden toy plane. His son. His son. They were laughing, sharing a moment beneath a sunlit sky. But the scene shifted. William was walking away, briefcase in hand, while the boy's voice called after him, distant and plaintive. "Dad, you forgot." And then the memory faded. William gasped, the watch trembling in his hands. "What is this? What did you do to me?" The clockmaker regarded him solemnly. "You've forgotten what matters most, Mr. Crow. Time has a way of blurring things, doesn't it? But this watch, it can help you. It can take you back, if you're willing." "Take me back," William whispered. His heart pounded, a mixture of hope and fear. "To where?" "To him." The clockmaker nodded. "But be warned. It's not without cost. To regain what you've lost, you must let go of what you've become." The choice. William stared at the watch. He could feel the weight of years pressing down on him, all the choices that had brought him to this lonely crossroads. He thought of his son's face, now a blur in his memory, and the ache of an unspoken promise. "What happens if I don't?" he asked quietly. The clockmaker tilted his head. "Then you continue as you are, a wanderer in the twilight, chasing ghosts that never were. The choice is yours." William closed his eyes. The ticking of the clocks seemed to grow louder, filling the shop with a relentless rhythm. He felt the pull of regret, the weight of time wasted, and then something lighter, hope. The turning of the key. William opened the watch. Inside, the hands were still. He turned the small key, winding it carefully. As the hands began to move, the world around him dissolved into golden light, the shop, the clockmaker, and the town of Willoughby fading into the glow. The gift of time. The golden light enveloped William as the world dissolved, the ticking of the watch blending with the pounding of his heart. He felt weightless, suspended in a river of light and shadow, as memories long buried surfaced like fragile blossoms. Laughter, sunlight, the warmth of small hands clutching his own. It all came rushing back. And then, as suddenly as it began, the light receded. William found himself in a room, dimly lit, its walls lined with clocks of every shape and size. Unlike the clockmaker's shop, these clocks didn't tick in unison. Each seemed to chime to its own rhythm, creating a symphony of time itself. At the center of the room stood the clockmaker, but he was different now, taller, younger, and radiating an ethereal glow. "This is the in-between," the clockmaker explained, his voice resonating like a bell. Time's threshold. Here, the threads of your life converge. Before you step forward, you must confront what you've left behind. Before William could reply, the air shimmered, and a figure stepped into view. His son, older now, with eyes so familiar they made William's chest tighten. The boy, no, the young man, regarded him, with a mix of longing and sadness. "Dad," he said softly, "you've been gone so long. Why?" "I was lost," William whispered, tears blurring his vision. "Lost in work, in regret, in everything but you." His son smiled faintly. "It's not too late, but you must let go of the past to truly come back." The clockmaker handed William a small key, different from the one that wound the watch. "This key will unlock the path you choose, William, but only one door can open." William turned toward two doors that had materialized. A weathered one marked regret and another, bright and inviting, marked hope. His hand trembled as he reached for the keyhole. As the door swung open, light poured through, warm and forgiving. On the other side, his son's laughter echoed, vibrant and full of life. Epilogue: in a park bathed in sunlight, a man sat on a bench, watching a boy with curly hair fly a wooden plane. The man smiled, tears glistening in his eyes as the boy ran to him. "Dad," the boy said breathlessly, holding out the plane. "You forgot this." William Crow took the plane, his hand steady, his heart full. "I won't forget. Again," he promised. And somewhere, in a place caught between moments, the clockmaker smiled. "Come on, Zaz, please. I just need a little," Quinn begged, fidgeting with the pearl charm on the necklace her mother had given her. "Quinn, I told you I don't have it, and even if I did I wouldn't give you any," Zaz said calmly. "You have to have it. You have every spice, herb, fungi, and ingredient that has ever existed in the whole history of witchcraft." Quinn shouted. Zaz gave one of her notorious looks. Quinn lowered her voice. "It's just a small spell. I can handle it." Zaz blew out a heavy sigh and leaned against the cash register. It was an old vintage one, full of character. The top was decorated with intricate swirling designs engraved on the silver metal. It was corroded in places, and sometimes the drawer needed a thump to get it to slide out. Quinn thought to herself that Zaz was like her cash register, old, full of character, and sometimes needed a little persuading. Quinn needed this ingredient for tonight. She had foolishly assumed Zaz's sizable collection of magical ingredients would have whispered. Zaz said sternly, "Despite the size of my collection, I don't have your ingredient and you still need to learn to control your magic." Quinn looked down at her salt-crusted boots so Zaz wouldn't see her cheeks turn bright red. After an awkward pause, Zaz broke the silence, gently asking, "Are you going trick-or-treating tonight?" "No," Quinn said, still avoiding looking Zaz in the eyes. "Halloween used to be your mom's favorite holiday, you know. She loved dressing up with you when you were little. I remember the year you wanted to be a human, while all the other girls dressed up as witches. She got a real kick from that." Quinn smiled with a soft sadness, trying to hide the real pain of the loss. Since her mother died, everything had changed. It felt as if her favorite color had been stripped from the world, and now everything was just off. For the past several months, Zaz had been trying to help Quinn gain control of her magic again, but it felt useless trying. How could Quinn possibly do that when the hole her mother left felt so big? Quinn thought if she could just see her one more time, could talk to her again, then everything would be better. At first, the idea of ever seeing her again seemed impossible, until she discovered an ancient, powerful spell that could bring back the spirit of the dead for one night, the night of All Hallows' Eve. Quinn had gotten everything ready for tonight. She had stashed her supplies in a secret location and had gotten all the ingredients except for one simple herb, Wisproot. She was so close to being able to see her mother again. She couldn't let this setback ruin her chance. "I have to go," Quinn said abruptly. Zaz pursed her lips and said, "Fine, but don't try using any magic tonight. It will be amplified by all the energy on Halloween and tonight's full moon." Quinn waved her left hand in the air, brushing aside any notion that she would even consider doing magic, and crossed her other fingers behind her back. "Of course. I'll be safe, I promise. As Quinn walked out the shop and onto Main Street, she called out, Toast! Toast, come on, we gotta go. And with that, a scruffy, disgruntled seagull wearing a little red beanie flew down and perched on her arm. She doesn't have the wisproot, we're gonna have to get it from somewhere else. Toast just squawked and tilted his head in response. Good idea, Toast. We can check the community garden. Mom and I planted some magic herbs down there a while back. Maybe one of them is wisproot. Quinn bent over the garden gate, wheezing and out of breath. She hadn't been to one of Rhode Island's community gardens since her mother died. The cold of October left most of the plots shriveled and bare. She walked down the path counting 1, 5, 13 rows back, the witching number. She knelt in the soil to read the plant's labels. Shadowfern, blue thistle, frostmire bloom. Aha! Wisproot, but all that was there was a dirt hole. Quinn looked in disbelief. Who would want to take a whole cluster of wisproot? Quinn grunted with frustration. It felt like the universe was against her, as if the thief took it to foil her plan. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. Zez took the wisproot, she whispered through clenched teeth. Zez didn't think Quinn could handle the spell, so she lied about having it in her collection and dug up the only other plant for miles. Quinn scraped up handfuls of half-frozen dirt, squeezing it in her fists, the mud stuffed under her nails, and the cold made her hands numb, but she didn't care. She couldn't believe Zaz would betray her like that. She hurled the dirt and let out a scream that cut through the garden like a boat sailing upwind. Quinn walked out of the garden with a newfound determination. If Zaz wasn't going to give her the wisproot, she would just have to take it herself. Zaz closes the shop soon, Quinn said. She keeps a spare key tucked under the awning. It's high up, so the only way to reach it is to levitate it down. Quinn stopped in her tracks, trying to think of a non-magic solution. She looked down at Toast, who was hopping down the sidewalk, struggling to keep up. She grined. Thankfully, I have you. As she rounded the corner, she saw Zaz standing outside, locking the door for the night. Quinn quickly turned back around the bend, hugging the wall. After a moment, she peered around to see Zaz walking in the opposite direction, and waited until she was out of sight. It was dark inside, but she could see through the window the shapes of the shelves lined with tonics and salves, along with dream catchers and scrap sculptures Zaz had crafted. Quinn picked up Toast and gave him a boost to the awning. He flapped his way up and dug around in the fabric until the key fell. Yes, Quinn cheered. As she slid into the shop, she whispered, Stay here, Toast. Zaz had told her many times, no birds in the shop. Quinn had been here thousands of times. It was like a second home, but this time she felt out of place. She crept into the back room where Zaz brewed all her positions and stored her supplies. Quinn found bottles, dried herbs, and pickled things. She checked the left corner where the roots were stored, but nothing. Then in the bottom middle where there was a cluster of purple ingredients, still nothing. She checked labels starting with the letter W, and bottles of dried and crushed herbs. She checked serums and pickling jars, but there was nothing, not a single wisproot. No. Quinn began to panic. Zaz wasn't lying, she didn't have any wisproot. Quinn paced the room, fidgeting with her mother's necklace. It reminded her of the time she was baking full moon cookies with her mother. They were out of sugar, so they used some honey as a replacement. Maybe she could use a substitute ingredient for the spell. Zaz always said magic is a combination of precise science and intuition. Quinn would have to hope that her intuition would be enough. Wisproot was used in the spell to make the spirit solidify in the living world. So perhaps rootbound, a mushroom known for its mycelium that wraps around tree roots and is often used to connect oneself with the earth, would work as an alternative. She grabbed a vial and ran out of the shop, knowing she was beginning to run out of time. Trick-or-treaters were mobbing the streets. Quinn tried to weave through the crowds, but she was slowed down by the bustling bodies. Under the brick arches of the fire station on Main Street, volunteers were handing out candy and playing Halloween games. It was swarming with a large group of sugar-high kids. There was no way around it. Quinn would have to go through. She navigated her way through until she was stuck in the heart of the crowd. She tried pushing by, but was tripped up by the excited children. She fell hard on the asphalt, her hands scraped by the loose gravel. She stood up and reached to feel her mother's necklace, only to find it had fallen off in the crowd. She got back on the ground and started searching frantically. A sea of storming shoes had swept away her treasure. She could feel her breath speeding up. Her head was spinning. She couldn't think, only feel the overwhelming sense of panic and rage sweeping her under. Toast scampered close to her, nuzzling himself under her arm trying to comfort her. Quinn pushed him away. I don't have time for this. Realizing midnight was coming quickly, she stood and plowed through the crowd, not caring who she elbowed or stepped on. She was fueled with the most powerful drive, desperation. Quinn sprinted back down the hill to the club and marina. She ran up to the little shelter by the docks where Kipper, the marina's launch driver, was packing up for the night. Kipper! Quinn called out. Kipper was about Quinn's age. They had seen each other around when Kipper was working odd jobs, like delivering pizza for Twisted, lifeguarding at Goddard Beach, and driving the launch boat at the marina. Sure, he seemed to like Quinn and would always try to talk with her when she was around, but she wouldn't consider him a friend, just an acquaintance, and a useful one at that. Kipper! Quinn called again. This time he poked his head out from the little shack. At first, he looked confused, but his face quickly lit up when he realized it was Quinn. Kipper! I need you to take me out to the hidden cove out on Goddard, Quinn told him as she ran towards Patience, the launch boat. But, the launch is closed for the night, plus I'm not supposed to take it out of the harbor, Kipper said, running his hand through his messy dark hair. Kipper! Just do it, Quinn yelled. It's really important, and I need to get there now. There's no time to walk down there. He stammered. Quinn stomped back up the docks, standing face to face with Kipper. If you won't take me, I'll just go myself. And she reached behind him to grab the keys hanging in the shed. Fine. But only for you, Quinn, Kipper said with a sigh. Quinn knew he would do it. He was like a puppy, she thought, too loyal and giving for his own good. Kipper grabbed the keys and hurried down to the boat. He revved the engine to a quiet rumble and crept the boat out of Greenwich Cove. Once he passed the red marker buoy, he sped up, leaving a trail of wake behind them. Quinn sat in silent determination, her hands clenched in fists. Kipper looked back and asked, So what's this super important midnight outing about? Quinn looked him up and down. She wasn't in the mood. It's none of your business, she replied coldly. Oh, Kipper said, her words a stab in the gut. Okay, he said, looking back towards the bow of the boat. They rowed in silence until the boat had gone past the main beachfront and then around the bend to a more secluded peninsula. This is as close as I can get without beaching the boat, Kipper said. Kipper, I need to do this alone. Quinn snipped. Okay, I get it. He said. No, you don't. Quinn muttered without looking back. He waited to make sure she got to land, then pulled the boat out and drove away. She pulled a cauldron, which she had stuffed with ingredients and a spell book, out from behind a shrub, gathered the timber she had stashed, and lit a fire below the pot. The beach was illuminated by the large full moon sitting in her throne of black night sky. The amber glow of the fire reflected on Quinn's face while she toiled away at her brew. She tossed in ingredient after ingredient, each one diving into the cauldron with a splash. As her potion grew, the swirling, pulsing magic around her grew too. Wispy blue and indigo tendrils reached up towards the heavens, and a luminous fog lingered across the sand. Quinn began to recite the enchantment written in the spell book. Her hands shook, but her voice remained steady. The spell grew stronger, and the beach was now covered with zapping, buzzing magic. Quinn was sweating, and her whole body was trembling from the weight of the spell. She squinted through the fog to see a figure emerging from the mist. It was her mother. The spell was working. She could almost see her face, only her mother didn't have a face. She was a silhouette of blue smoke. Quinn reached in her pocket and pulled out the vial of root bond. She tossed it in the pot, and the magic swooshed out angrily. Blue and purple swirls turned dark and red. The buzz of magic became a roar as powerful tentacles of light and smoke lunged up. The spell was going wrong. Quinn clenched her fists in the air, trying to hold it all together. Amidst the chaos, she heard the engine of a boat speeding towards the beach. She glanced over to see Zaz and Kipper wading through the water, calling her name. No! Quinn shouted she couldn't let them ruin this. Her ghostly mother was right there growing closer and closer. Quinn! Her friends yelled. They pushed against the tornado of magic and sand, gaining ground faster than her mother was. Quinn howled. Using one hand to hold the spell, she shot out her other towards the pair, sending red zapping coils towards them. They wrapped around them, holding them up in the air. She looked back to see the shadow of her mother flicker. She refocused her concentration on the spell, frantically throwing ingredients in the cauldron, hoping something would work. Her mother was standing so close now she reached out her hand towards Quinn. Just then a bell rang out in the distance. Bong, bong, bong. Chimed 12 times, midnight. Her mother evaporated, the smoke dispersing out in all directions. It was over. She failed. Quinn fell to her knees, hot tears running down her cheeks, landing in the sand. Her mother was gone. She had tried to control her magic, but she couldn't bring her back. She felt all alone. Squawk! Quinn looked up to see Toast circling the others. She had been so quick to blame them for her failure, telling herself they were working against her, but this whole time they were trying to help. She had to make it right, she had to save them. Quinn turned and pushed the cauldron over. It spilled into the sand and sea, dosing out the fire, but the magic still swirled and thrashed around them. She would have to control her magic. She reached out and touched the energy strands. The magic pulsed through her. She closed her eyes and tried to focus the magic into one strand of energy. It fought back, ripping and curling, refusing to be tamed. Quinn reached deep down inside of herself and saw a pool of golden liquid. She saw her reflection and her mother's too. She dipped her hands into the pool, reached in, and pulled out a glowing crystal ball. It sparkled, colors filled with memories, loss, growth, and love. She slowly opened her eyes and saw herself controlling all the wild magic into one silver strand. Lowering her friends safely to the ground, she let her magic disperse into the night air. Zaz, Kipper, and Toast all came running towards her. Toast flew hard into her chest, making her stumble back a step. She hugged him tight. Then Zaz came up and embraced her too. She rested her head on Zaz's shoulder and breathed in her familiar smell. Kipper placed a hand on her shoulder. Quinn had been so desperate to see her mother again, she had been willing to push away love in pursuit of it. "How did you guys find me?" Quinn asked, looking around at their faces. Zaz replied, "It was getting late, so I went to the docks to look for you, but found Kipper sitting by himself. He told me everything." "Yeah," Quinn said, embarrassed. This time she didn't hide her red cheeks, instead she apologized for everything. When Quinn got home with Zaz, she dragged herself exhausted to her room. Toast perched on the edge of her bed and looked at her with a head tilt. She looked at him and then down on her pillow where her mother's necklaces was waiting for her. She smiled to herself and clasped it around her neck. "Thank you," she whispered as she let the soft medley of ocean waves sing her to sleep. Gerald looked up as his wife Christy came into the living room. To his surprise, she was wearing her coat and carrying a small suitcase. "Where are you going?" he said. "Did we have plans? And I forgot?" "I am going somewhere," Christy said. "I think I want a divorce, and I need a break to think about it." "What?" said Gerald, bewildered. "What did I do wrong? We haven't even had an argument." "It might be better if we had." "You are such a doormat," she said with a sigh. "I kept hoping you had a personality, but all you do is agree. I ask what you want for dinner and you say whatever. I ask what movie you want to watch and you don't care. I ask which color we should paint the living room and you say I can choose. But, I really don't mind," Gerald said. "I'm glad to do whatever makes you happy. That's why I let you decide. I was trying to be considerate. You wanted someone who was easy to get along with." Christy rolled her eyes. "There's being considerate and then there's being apathetic and spineless. You don't speak up for yourself. At work either, which is why they walk all over you. I don't want a yes man. I want a partner I can talk to. Someone who can challenge me in a healthy way." She ran her hand through her hair and shook her head. "I'm sorry. I do love you, but I'm going to stay with my sister tonight. I'll be back tomorrow." The front door slammed behind her. Gerald looked in the mirror and sighed. If he wasn't the only person in the room, he wouldn't even have noticed himself. It was much easier to describe what he wasn't than what he was. He wasn't handsome and he wasn't ugly. He wasn't tall and he wasn't short. He wasn't fat and he wasn't thin. He was average, bland, innocuous. 5 minutes after meeting him, most people could not have thought of a single adjective to describe him. Since his personality matched his appearance, this had not bothered Gerald until now. He was content to be the easygoing, amenable, quiet guy in the background who was willing to pick up the slack at work or change his schedule at short notice to accommodate a coworker. A wave of panic washed over him at the thought that Christy might not come back. He threw on his jacket and went out for a walk. It was a wet, gray day. Gerald shivered as he strode along the path through the park. At least the raindrops disguised the tears on his cheeks. Head down, lost in thought, he suddenly collided with a solid body. "Oh, it's you, Malcolm. I'm sorry. I was miles away," he said, embarrassed. Malcolm, a stocky man in his early 30s, stepped back and surveyed Gerald, frowning. "Who died? You look terrible. Let's grab a drink." Before Gerald could object, Malcolm grabbed his arm and steered him down a different path towards the main street and into a small bar. As he slid into the booth Malcolm indicated, Gerald wondered if this was what Christy meant when she said he was spineless. Malcolm returned with 2 brandies. "Medicinal purposes," he said. "You look like you need it." Gerald, who hardly ever drank, sipped, coughed and launched into a semi-coherent explanation. "I don't know what she wants," he said. "I can't be someone I'm not. Should I dye my hair? Get a piercing or a tattoo? New clothes?" Malcolm laughed. "I might be gay, but I'm not your queer eye for the straight guy. Look at me. I can barely coordinate my own clothes." Gerald looked at him and reluctantly smiled. Malcolm was dressed in his usual scruffy plaid shirt and jeans. "True, you're not exactly flamboyant. But what should I do?" Malcolm frowned. "It's not your appearance that's bothering her. It's your behavior. Why are you so passive?" "Dr. Malcolm is in. My father was a big, aggressive bully," Gerald said. "I learned to blend into the scenery so he forgot I was there most of the time. I hate conflict. I just want to get along with people." "Having an opinion of your own is not the same as conflict," Malcolm said. "What kind of movies do you like? What color do you want to paint the living room?" "I don't know," Gerald said. He shrugged. "It's easier just to agree to whatever people want." Malcolm raised his eyebrows. "No wonder Christy's getting frustrated. Go home and make a list of what you really like. Think about who you really are." He glanced at his watch. "Oops, got to run. Call me if I can do anything." Gerald finished his drink and left the bar, feeling a little woozy. He turned into the park. A group of teenagers was blocking the path, boisterously joking and shoving each other. Gerald detoured through the shrubbery to avoid them. He suddenly noticed some animal leaping above him. He stared. A dog in the treetops? Something landed on him with a thud, and he yelled as sharp teeth pierced his arm before the creature disappeared. The teenagers came running. "Are you okay, man?" "No kidding. But that was a monkey." "Dude, your arm's bleeding. You'd better get to the hospital. My truck's over there." "Come on, guys." They hustled Gerald off to a beat-up pickup truck and sped off, rap music blaring. They deposited him at the emergency room entrance and screeched off before he could thank them. Wondering if the day could get any weirder, he tried to explain his predicament to the doctor. "Hey, what bit you?" said the doctor. "Have you been drinking?" "I'd only had 1 drink. I swear it was a monkey," said Gerald. The doctor looked up with interest. "Some monkeys did escape from a research place near here today. It's not a deep bite, so you should be fine. We'll give you a course of antibiotics just to be on the safe side." "Anyone here with you?" "I'll call my friend," Gerald said. Malcolm showed up soon after, shaking his head and trying not to smile. "Go ahead and laugh," said Gerald. "Ridiculous, I know. At least it took my mind off Christy." Once at home, he had just settled down in front of the television when the doorbell rang. "Christy, did you forget your keys?" he called, jumping to his feet. His smile faded as he opened the door to find two women he had never seen before standing there. "Good evening," the woman said. "I am Dr. Jones, and this is Dr. Macmillan. We are researchers at the Institute. The hospital is required to report all animal bites, so we think you were attacked by one of our escaped monkeys. May we come in for a moment?" "Sure," said Gerald, shrugging and pointing to the living room. "Have a seat. Would you be interested in participating in our study?" said Dr. Jones. She handed Gerald some paperwork. "Could you please complete this over the next few days and return it to us? We're interested in any odd or unusual symptoms that you notice." "Why?" Gerald said. "I know to call the doctor if the bite gets red or looks infected." Dr. Macmillan cleared her throat. "These are genetically altered monkeys. We're curious as to what the effects from the bite might be if some of their DNA was transferred to you. Obviously, we can't intentionally let human subjects get bitten." Gerald stared. "So, I'm a guinea pig? Am I likely to grow a tail or get some nasty disease?" Dr. Jones smiled. "Nothing like that. We've been researching difference in personality traits of siblings raised in the same environment, such as why some grow up timid and some assertive. There's a consent form you would have to sign if you're interested in participating. No rush. We can come back tomorrow." Gerald stood up and showed them out. "I'd need to think about it. It's been a very long day. Good night." He shut the door behind them and tossed the folder onto the coffee table. Suddenly exhausted, he headed upstairs and gratefully collapsed into bed. When he woke the next morning, the previous day's events seemed like a dream until he remembered Christie's absence and the bandage on his arm. Luckily, it was his day off. He made himself breakfast and wandered into the living room where Christie had left a handful of paint cards. Picking them up, he looked around the room and got to work. Christie, returning a couple of hours later, stopped in her tracks. All the furniture was in the middle of the room covered in dust sheets, and Gerald was spreading a drop cloth on the floor. "There you are," he said, sweeping her into a bear hug. "I've missed you." Christie disentangled herself from his grasp. "I missed you too. Sorry about yesterday. It's just that." "Never mind that now," said Gerald. "I've been thinking, why don't we try this color on this wall, and this color over here? I think it would be a nice contrast." Christie grinned. "You look like my husband. But who are you really?" Gerald's phone rang. "Hey, bud," said his coworker Dave. "I know it's last minute, but can you come in and cover for me? I forgot it's our wedding anniversary. Jenny's going to kill me if I don't make plans pronto." "I'm sorry, but you should have thought about that earlier," Gerald said without hesitation. "Got plans of my own." "Oh," said Dave. "No need to be short, man. You're usually so cool about agreeing to everything that I thought." "Not this time," said Gerald. "See you later." He hung up and paused, appalled. "What came over me?" he said. "Oh well, did you just refuse an unreasonable request?" said Christie. "Wonders will never cease." "Before I forget," Gerald said, "I've invited Malcolm over for pizza. He was a huge help yesterday bringing me home from the hospital." "Hospital?" said Christie. "It's a long story. Put your bag away while I order the pizza, and I'll tell you all about it." Malcolm should be here any moment. The three of them were sitting in the kitchen eating when the doorbell rang. Christie looked at Gerald. "Are you expecting someone?" "Oh, that'll be the doctors from the Institute. The ones who lost the monkey." Christie looked at Malcolm. He shrugged. "Beats me," he said as Gerald returned to the kitchen, followed by the two women. "Sorry to interrupt," said Dr. Jones. "We came by to pick up the consent form. Do you have any questions?" "I do," said Gerald. "Was I bitten by one of the assertive monkeys or one of the timid ones?" "One of the assertive ones," said Dr. Macmillan. "She's been a handful from the get-go. That wasn't the first time she's escaped. This study would require me to have blood drawn and answer questions every 6 months for at least 5 years?" "That's correct," said Dr. Jones. "I've thought about it, and I've decided I don't want to participate," said Gerald. Dr. Jones leaned forward. "But I assure you that..." Gerald shook his head. I wish you luck with your research, but you'll have to find another subject. Have her bite one of you. Let me show you out, he said, leading them out. He's suddenly being so decisive, said Malcolm. I wonder if that monkey bite inoculated him with some assertiveness. Whatever, said Christy. It's good timing. We have to decide what color to paint the baby's room too. What did you say? Said Gerald as he returned. Baby? You mean? Yes. I found out for sure yesterday. You're going to be a dad. I think that's why I've been so emotional lately. You don't think we have to worry about this monkey stuff, do you? No, said Gerald, laughing. Between the two of you, you gave me a big wake-up call and I appreciate it. Love you both. This whole mess started last year, 3 weeks before Christmas. I was then working in a big company where everyone moved a lot, but no one really knew what they were doing. Chasing the future, shaping the world, and bending the rules of engineering were our mottos, which, looking back, sound borderline delusional. But back in those days, it was my way of life. I was doing something awesome, even if it was almost impossible to describe my job or challenges to anyone from the outside world. It was too complicated and abstract, and I had learned over the years that none of my friends or family members cared to ask about it anymore. My days were stressful, but I never complained. I had a vision, a mission, and a personal challenge to be the best by age 35. I was laser-focused on getting what I wanted, so I spent that year chasing every opportunity to get a promotion, as I had done the previous ones. I never said no to an impossible deadline, impossible hours, or demanding managers, and that's why the night when I got the biggest surprise of my life was the continuation of a really proper, undoubtful, horrible day at work. It was a Friday. I had started the day early because I had an alignment call with different production and sales sites multi-sites call, and the short alignment turned into a 3-hour nightmare with people from all around the world shouting at each other in different languages. That was common, the discussions, but did not help me reach the Zen state I had planned to face my end-year review, scheduled for the end of the day. As usual, I had been working on it for weeks, checking my lists of targets and aligning them with the achievements and feedback from colleagues I'd worked with. I had written what I thought about my job and was ready to explain in detail why I deserved to move up in the corporate food chain. I had even prepared cheat cards to help me prepare for the discussion, which I put inside my notebook and checked between meetings that day. There was no readier person than me. There was no way I did not get what I wanted. But then, my boss canceled the meeting, and I lost the little chill I still had in my system. I threw away my cards, and like a child on a bad day, I decided to ignore his message, the one he sent me 5 minutes before our meeting, telling me he would not be able to be on time, and sat in front of his office, with my arms crossed and a face that could deter the biggest baitist wolf. I could have shot lasers with my eyes if I wasn't so tired after working so many hours, and, of course, if I wasn't a simple mortal without any superpowers, but that's another minor detail. I waited for him until 6:30 in the afternoon. When he finally appeared in his office, he told me I could reschedule and to hurry up because we would be late for the restaurant. That night was the department's Christmas party. Too early to celebrate the festivities, but the only option you have when the person in charge forgets to book the restaurant on time. That's what we all knew had happened, but according to our manager, we can celebrate whenever we want. And there's not much you can tell your boss when he's the one who messes up. As soon as he entered, he left his office, so much so that I did not have the opportunity to tell him how upset I was about his behavior. I had busted my whole body that year and had the right to my 60 minutes of discussion, and he had denied them to me. I was not happy at all, but I watched him leave, and I did not manage to get into the same elevator as he did. Even the elevators were failing me. I got into my car and drove to the meeting point, where I found most of my colleagues. Our boss had not arrived yet despite leaving before me, and we waited for him for half an hour outside the restaurant until someone, not me this time, decided that waiting more was not an option. It was cold and rainy, which would not be something to remember if it wasn't the last time I was annoyed by weather phenomena. Inside, we drank until it was clear he had stood us up, so we did our best, ordering whatever we wanted and paying with the company credit card. After all, he had told us we could celebrate, so we did. After exchanging Secret Santa presents where I got a ridiculous pair of battery-powered earrings in the shape of Christmas trees, we moved to a bar nearby, and to our surprise, that's where we found our boss, in the company of a man who looked quite shady. We started to order some drinks, and a colleague of mine thanked the boss for giving us celebration space, which was ridiculously funny to most of the group but turned out to be not so well received by the man in the suit, who held his drink as the little guy in The Lord of the Rings did with the ring. The only thing missing was the "my precious" speech because our manager, that middle-aged man, seemed consumed, with his eyes injected with blood and the least amicable expression ever. The man by his side dressed much more casually, in jeans, a t-shirt, and a distressed leather jacket. It seemed they both had been drinking for hours, but the way they looked indicated that there was something other than alcohol in their bodies. Before my colleague could say anything else, the casual guy stood up and held him by the coat's lapel until I saw his feet leave the floor. It surprised me because he did not seem so strong, and while I thought about the last time I had had the opportunity to exercise, one of the women in the bar started to scream. My thoughts had so absorbed me that I had not seen that the man had sunk his teeth in my colleague's neck, and now there was blood all over them. Okay, that's something else, I thought, as people started to run in all directions, some leaving the bar and others being stopped by different customers. The screaming was unbearable, and everything seemed to move in slow motion despite the running, jumping, and fighting around me. But that was not the only thing. There were teeth everywhere, and blood. A tremendous and very unhealthy loss of blood. I looked at my boss, who seemed amused by the whole situation, and started to walk in my direction as if nothing was happening around us. I grabbed my purse and began to think about all the self-defense classes I had had in the past 2 in total, and I tried to find something to use in case things turned even worse than they looked. I saw no use in the lipstick, and despite my eyeshadow palette being pointy, I did not think it could do much harm either. I touched my wallet, the perfume, and some papers before I chose my weapon. My keychain with a Hello Kitty figure full of hand sanitizer. The man, babbling something I could not understand, extended his arm in my direction. With no mercy whatsoever, I squeezed the sanitizer kitty in his already red eyes, which made him howl and gave me the space I needed to try to escape. Have I told you I'm not so good at sports? I always said running was not my thing unless I had a rabid animal following me, and that's precisely what happened that night. I jumped over bodies and pools of blood. I passed what seemed to be a buffet of coworkers, and when I reached the door and pushed, I crashed into someone, and I couldn't move anymore. Suddenly, I was up in the air with 2 giant hands holding me and smelling the worst breath ever. My kitty was empty, and I grabbed one of the keys which I used to stab the mountain-sized guy in the cheek. But the outcome was not as expected because he did not budge, say a word, or bleed. With my feet dangling, feeling small and impotent, I said, "Man, I hadn't the best day today. Can we leave this for another time?" He didn't seem impressed by my cold blood, but even more attracted. When his teeth touched my neck, the only thing I could think about was all the things I hadn't done, all the places I hadn't visited, and all the people I had not met yet, but it did not matter. The blood started to run over my coat, and I knew I was done. When I woke up, I was hungry. I was in my bed, and when I looked around me, the floor was dirty and covered with bloody clothes. I looked below the sheets. I was naked. The light was too bright, and I closed the curtains. It was easy to see everything around me, even with no lights on, and when I looked for my glasses and put them on, it felt as if someone had stabbed my eyes. Everything was blurry, and my eyes hurt. I took them out and put some clothes on. There was a lot of noise around me, but there was no one at home and no radio or television on. Still, I could hear people talking, babies crying, dogs barking. I covered my ears with my hands and walked out of the room to the kitchen. I needed coffee. What time was it? Was it a work day? How much time had I been sleeping? I switched on the coffee machine but disconnected it immediately because I couldn't stand the noise. "It gets better," someone said behind me. My boss. I started to pinch myself in the arm to wake me up. It's a nightmare, I thought. I have a really soft skin, I thought after the pinch. "It was time to give you a promotion. I am sure you knew you deserved it," he continued. "What?" I said. I wanted to ask who and what he was, what had happened, why I felt so weird, why he seemed so relaxed, how he had entered my house, and why my skin felt so awesome, But that's not what I said. I said, "What? We have a lot of work to do," he replied. "We should get you something to eat. I don't think whatever you have in the fridge will taste good now." I lost my heart. It didn't vanish suddenly. If it had, it might have been easier to find, like my mind too, which I always rediscover in some drawer. But no, I lost it slowly and imperceptibly. All our hearts shine green for hope, yellow for joy, and red for love. Long time ago, mine glowed neon red, covering my entire being. Some gazed with joy, and those with a hole where their heart should be, with envy. In fact, trying to fill other people's voids, I lost my own heart. And it worked. In my presence, all hearts began to glow. Some people are born without a heart. Mine could only falsely replace theirs. Heartless people always left once theirs started to glow, only to once it faded. I welcomed them until my heart dimmed was lost. For years after, I stayed home, staring at the walls, unable to snap out of the shock of realization. The next stage of mourning involved staring at a screen showing black and white movies. But during that time, I'd experienced sudden, intense bouts of crying without any particular trigger. They didn't last long but were frequent. Finally, I entered the stage of questioning, then reflecting and ultimately learning about the nature of people with holes. That's when I learned that if you've ever had a heart, it can't simply disappear. Someone most likely stole it. Those who lost their hearts and wanted them back ventured into the labyrinth, a place where all lost hearts reside. Although I didn't know if my heart's thief had kept it, sold it, or discarded it in the labyrinth, my only option was to try and search for it there. On my way to the labyrinth, I felt deeply uncomfortable because of the hole in me. Shame and humiliation consumed me. People passing by either pitied me or resolutely ignored me. I quickened my steps to hide among those searching for their hearts, just like me. Lost in thought, I realized people with hearts were in the minority. It frightened and saddened me. Most people with holes felt no shame, walking freely, even resisting the idea of having a heart. They scowled, schemed, and disrupted others, driven by an inexplicable sense of superiority. This pushed me into a sprint toward the labyrinth, as being on the streets was unbearable without at least hope. Panting, I arrived at the entrance to the labyrinth, only to be halted by a sudden thought. "Are you sure you want your heart back?" I asked myself in fear. It was your heart that caused you so much pain, allowed so many betrayals by those closest to you, and left you isolated for so long. What if they take it again? I hesitated, but I knew it was better to feel something, even pain, than nothing at all. Without this journey, I wasn't alive. Before entering, one final thought, or rather Virginia Woolf's quote, passed through my mind. "You cannot find peace by avoiding life." I stepped in. Found the labyrinth's hidden entrance by noticing one bush seemed deeper. Perspective, I thought as I stepped in. One good or bad thing was that my decisions would be made solely on an intellectual level, as I'd lost my intuition along with my heart. The first decision I had to make didn't seem solvable by intellect. Left or right. The Cheshire Cat might have said, "If you don't know where you're going, then it doesn't matter which way you take." That's right. Whichever path I choose, it'll lead me somewhere. I chose left and stopped again. But how do people exit the labyrinth if they don't know how they entered or where they're going? I was never short on questions. Answers, on the other hand, were scarce but, fortunately, rarely missed. You can't open an umbrella just because you expect rain. First things first, find your heart. If and when you succeed, then think about leaving. Nature mostly takes care of everything itself. Just around the first corner, the labyrinth became dark, almost impenetrable, and utterly silent. In the darkness and stillness, I suddenly felt lost, afraid I'd never find my way. I wasn't sure if I was moving at all until I bumped into a man sitting on the ground. "Oh, excuse me, I didn't see you." "Don't worry. No one ever notices me." "But that's for the better," he said. I sat beside him and asked, "Doesn't it bother you that others don't notice you? It's like you don't exist." "Exactly. But don't be fooled, that's the ultimate freedom." "I sold my shadow to forget the past," he said quietly. Now I'm invisible, free from everything. I no longer feel pain, sadness, or fear. But that's emptiness, I said, struggling to understand his indifferent contentment. Yes, but an empty man doesn't know he's empty. His words echoed hollowly. I touched shoulder of the man that sold his shadow and said, freedom without emotion isn't life. I stood up and followed the faint green threads glowing along the walls until I finally emerged into the light. In front of me, bathed in light, sat a beautiful woman wearing an opaque glass mask. The mask was sculpted into the face of a goddess. The labyrinth was filled with mirrors, cold, shining, interrupted by cracks through which searing light shone, like from a volcano. As I turned around, I noticed that my reflection was different in every crack, but the reflection of the woman with the glass face remained the same. Amazed by her beauty, I couldn't hold back my words. You are beautiful, I whispered to her, my mouth almost agape. Thank you, dear. Everyone tells me that. She spoke gently with an angelic voice. Without taking my eyes off her, I asked, but why the mask? Oh, please don't mention the mask. I'm afraid it might break any moment and reveal my real face, she said, sounding ashamed. What kind of face must it be to need hiding? I couldn't understand. Vulnerable, my dear, vulnerable. If people without hearts saw my true face, they'd all rush to wound me. With this cold expression on the mask, they feel awe instead. The mask doesn't hide my face, she confessed. It hides my fear of what I'd be without it. I understood her fear, shame, and humiliation entirely. I felt the same. All my life, I allowed others' words to be my judge and jury. But now, surrounded by my own reflections, I realized, only I know who I am, and I have the right to define myself. Looking at the different reflections, I realized each one defined me in its own way. Half-consciously, I told her, I am not just one face, one moment, one feeling. Every reflection is a part of me, and I am all of them together. The woman with the glass face froze. Her hands trembled, and behind the glass, I could see her eyes quivering. Whether with fear or admiration, I couldn't tell. As the mirrors around me glittered with thousands of reflections, it felt like the whole world was spinning. My voice echoed, colliding with the cracks in my reflections, and every word became clearer to me. Turning around. In a whirlwind, I shouted, but I no longer want to hide my vulnerability. I don't want to worry about what others think of me. Only by being my authentic self will others' words cease to hurt me. I am not just one mask. I am 1,000 versions. I am not just a reflection in the mirror. I am a person of flesh and blood, with all my joys and sorrows, pains and hopes. In one nuclear second, all the mirrors shattered, and the light from the cracks exploded into a blazing glow. Time stopped and space broke into pieces. The light didn't just explode. It suffused everything, flooding the labyrinth with warmth and brilliance. I felt the light permeating me, erasing fear and doubt. When the flash subsided, the labyrinth was empty. The woman and the mirrors had vanished, leaving only silence and an open path ahead of me. Suddenly, my heart began to glow faintly green. I was on the verge of tears. My beautiful heart. It seemed sadder to see it weak than to see the whole. As the green light filled the space within me, I realized the walls had fallen, the masks disappeared, and I was free to be myself again. Gently placing my hand over my heart, as if afraid to lose even this faint glow, I rounded the next corner and emerged into a vast meadow covered in primroses. At its center stood a magnificent tree with a majestic canopy. I felt my journey nearing its end, though I couldn't predict how. Beneath the tree sat a pale figure of a man, his ink-stained fingers buried under piles of crumpled papers. His eyes were empty, as if searching through the world for something he couldn't find. Approaching him, I noticed he was crumpling sheet after sheet of unwritten paper. Carefully, I asked him, "Are you writing?" He lifted his gaze and stared at me as if now seeking in me what he couldn't find elsewhere. Giving up on his stare, he lowered his head again and replied, "Yes, and no." How can it be both? I was confused. Yes, I was a poet. No, I've lost my inspiration writing what they wanted, not the truth. Now I don't recognize my voice. I'm the poet who lost his inspiration, he confessed. His heart, like mine, glowed green. We both still held on to hope, but we had nothing to feel joy for. I sat beside him, wrapping my arms around my knees, and confessed, the same thing happened to me, only I lost my heart. It hasn't glowed red in a long time. Ah, he warned me gravely, don't be deceived. For a poet to be an artist, their heart must glow red. Hope and joy alone are not enough for good poetry. Yes, I suppose that's true for all art, I said, unfolding one of his crumpled papers. And now what? I asked, not sure if I was posing the question to him or to myself. Now we wait. After a short silence, during which we sat as though our hands were tied, he continued, you know, sometimes it feels like she's gliding in on an irresistible sunbeam, serene and quiet, but the sea immediately washes over the beam, and she disappears. Startled, I quickly grabbed a pen and begged him to repeat what he said, as if I hadn't heard it. I wrote down his words and stared at them in awe. What did you write? He asked curiously. Half in disbelief, I replied. A verse? Oh, so you're a poet too? I looked at him with joy, handing him the paper. No, you are. His pupils scanned the verse repeatedly, while his green heart began to glow yellow. He leaped to his feet, grabbed my hand, and lifted me with him, beaming with joy, exclaiming, and now? What do we do now? Sadly, I didn't know the answer, but the poet continued. My inspiration was here all along. I had buried it, fearing the pain of its return. I began to understand, too. The tree. Yes, the tree. It doesn't try to grow. It's in its nature to grow. Of course, it needs care, but it grows on its own. Yes, hearts and inspiration cannot be lost. They are the foundations of our being. They don't come from the mind. They are present in our everyday experiences, even in our unplanned outbursts. My heart was never lost. I had simply neglected it. Like the poet's inspiration, I didn't need to search for it. I needed to let it be revealed. And here it was, with the yellow primroses, my regained yellow glow filling the meadow with joy. We both paused and looked at each other. There was still the red glow to uncover. Together we laughed, and simultaneously declared, we wait with joy. As I joyfully danced to bid farewell to the poet, I heard the sound of children's laughter, the murmur of a brook, and the chirping of birds behind me. Turning around, I saw a little girl giggling as she sat by a stream, building a tower out of pebbles. Overjoyed to see her, I sat beside her. She seemed oddly familiar. She cupped her hands, whispering, dark, then opened them, laughing, light. She giggled every time. Watching her play her dark-light game, I delighted in her carefree spirit. To her, darkness and light were equal. She didn't analyze them, nor fear the darkness. On the contrary, she giggled at it. Falling onto the grass with laughter, she looked at me and asked, do you want to play with us? I didn't want to confuse her or question her joy, but there was no one there except her. As if reading my mind, she introduced me to her imaginary friend on her right. She made me laugh so sweetly. How many friends do you have? I asked. Oh, as many as I want. I just need to imagine them. Just like you with the friends you've met in the labyrinth. You just need to imagine, and you'll never be alone. Were all those people an illusion? I asked, frightened. So what if they were? Illusion is imagination. And you know what they say, imagination can do anything. It would have been boring without it. She wasn't running from illusion, nor was she angry at it. She knew it was her imagined world, and she simply played in it, creating and loving in the moment. Well, will you build walls with us or not? My friend is getting impatient. Once again, she made me laugh. This little girl with a silky red ribbon in her messy hair, a crumpled red dress, short red socks, and muddy patent red shoes with straps. Her knees were bruised and scraped from play, But of course, none of that bothered her. While I smiled, lost in thought about her, she handed me a pebble. Come on, let's build the wall. My friend and I have already made it tall. Keep going. Fearful of ruining their game, I said, but what if I don't know how? Oh, everyone knows how to build walls. It's the easiest thing. And you've built many. Already. Come on. I carefully placed the pebble on the tower and felt triumphant when it didn't fall. Then, like a playful bolt of lightning, her little hand unexpectedly toppled the tower with a joyful shout, crash! But, I stammered, completely taken aback. All that effort. Don't you feel sorry? She giggled again. Sorry? This is a game. Everything's a game. And walls are meant to be knocked down, aren't they? She said, looking at me with a maternal wisdom. Of course, for her, walls were neither burdens nor held any significance. Walls are hard to build but easy to break. We played other games too, like, Guess Who I Am? She always chose something insulting for herself, like piglet, witch, or thief. Each time her imaginary friend and I guessed who she was, she'd laugh, fall to the ground, and kick her little feet in delight. She didn't care about labels or epithets. To her, questioning who she was felt like a waste of time that could be better spent playing. Finally, we played hide and seek. She always wanted me to search for her while she hid. After a few rounds of finding her, she told me, "See, you always find me. No one can hide from everyone." In the last round, she hid for so long that I started to worry. My voice trembled as I called for her. The ground beneath me felt unsteady. The labyrinth seemed to collapse, and the pressure in my chest almost robbed me of breath. I feared I'd never find her, or myself. Sensing my fear, she called out from somewhere, "Don't worry, I'm here, right where I've always been. You're just looking in the wrong place again." Outside, a flood of emotions overwhelmed me. She was inside me. She was me. The labyrinth filled with red light as unbearable pain surged through my chest, my heart trembling with a strength I didn't know how to handle. "Why are you afraid of your heart?" The girl's voice was soft but piercing. "The heart knows how to love. Just let it. Don't resist." I wrestled with fear until her voice reached my heart. "Do you love me?" The red light engulfed the sky and earth as I whispered through my tears. "Yes, I love you. I've always loved you." Her giggles resonated within me, filling the silence with their answer. The labyrinth dissolved shimmering. Dust as my heart blazed neon red, brighter than ever. The labyrinth wasn't a prison but a crucible. It had forged me stronger. This wasn't the end but the start of a vivid, uncertain path. The one that I chose to how shape one step, one heartbeat at a time. Implied death of animals. Torhan and Irene were caught up in the mob, headed to the border crossing. Upon arrival, the crossing was closed. Yelling, barking dogs and screams filled the air. The couple made sure they had a tight grip on each other. "This is not doing us or anyone else any good," Torhan whispered to Irene. "Stay close to me." She nodded. Slowly but aggressively, Torhan guided them away from the pushing mob. There was a bombed-out first-floor apartment wall. "Room with a view," he grinned. "Some view." The couple cuddled together in the corner, away from the yelling mob. They were safe, at least for now, which was all they had. I don't understand any of this. It happened so quickly. One day, normal, next day, utter chaos. We are safe. We have to stay together. If we get separated. Irene smiled. A loud explosion. This one was close. Screams and yelling, calling out for loved ones and friends. The mob then scattered. The couple were hidden just enough from the mob running by their hiding place. Torhan and Irene sighed but kept on high alert. How did it all come to this? I heard. The leaders were in agreement. Papers were signed. There were cheers and much excitement. How did it go so very wrong? Torhan smiled. It was swift. Remember, you were studying microbiology when we met. Torhan smiled. That was a little over a month ago. It was my last year PhD in neuroscience. We met in the Commons. Irene smiled. The smiles soon left. And now we are here. We were somewhat shielded from the rest of the world at university. That was nice. Then the news. Total disbelief. Then the explosions followed by chaos and destruction. So quickly lives changed. Forever, Irene said, cuddling closer into Torhan. My class took shelter in the safe lab, haha, and we continued to work on our research. Nothing else we could do. Just keep safe. I was concerned not knowing where you were or even if you survived the blast, Irene said. Torhan smiled. Interesting, I wonder if the election outcome was different, would the humans have reacted differently? Or would the result have been the same? Both thought and shrugged their shoulders. Remember that movie long ago, how that actor talked about just this same scenario, how it could not end? Well, why didn't people listen to his words? A movie, fiction. Well, not anymore. Why did they not get the point? Are all humans so self-absorbed? We are doomed, Irene sighed. Torhan smiled. Maybe, but for now we have to figure out how to survive. Agree. Silent cuddling amidst occasional explosions. Then silence. Did you hear that? Hear what? Listen. Both quietly listened. A low whimpering sound. There, hear it? I think it is coming from that pile of rubble, Torhan pointed to as he leaned forward. Irene left the safety of the corner and ventured out. Over here? Yes, listen. Silence. Whimpering. Got it. Irene scanned the rubble pile of the collapsed room. Moments later, she returned to the corner cuddling a bloody puppy. Torhan reached out, took hold of the puppy and began to scan it for wounds. He settled down next to Irene. The blood is not hers. The puppy began to shiver. Torhan cleaned off as much of the blood as he could with his shirt, then put the pup inside of his jacket for warmth. Water. I bet she is thirsty. Irene washed off her hands, then cupped one while Torhan poured water into it. The pup drank. The three sat cuddled together, leaning against the bombed-out concrete wall. Rest while you can, Torhan said. Pup closed her eyes. Irene drifted off. Torhan was wide awake, thoughts flowing like the smoke from the explosions. How did this once beautiful place become a war zone in just a little over a month? Torhan leaned his head against the cold wall. He closed his eyes. Everyone knew there would be some differences after the debates. There always is. But this? His eyes flashed open, and he leaned forward. This as he looked out onto the rubble. He leaned back, rested his head and closed his eyes. The signs were there. This could have been averted. He can see that now, subtle as they may have been. But they were there. Patterns. There were patterns from the past. He sees that now. History teaches, but who is there to listen? He remembered his teaching from the past. He didn't need to use this. Now he does. We are only in control of our responses to a situation. Cannot control that situation. Could they have changed this chaos from the sloughs that were missed? And how long ago to? See this? He shook his head. Nothing he could have done. Torhan opened his eyes. He turned his head to gaze at his family now, Irene and Pup. He closed his eyes. What is the next step? Plan. Stay alive and healthy. But right now, relax and think. He smiled. Oh right, the conspirators. People would laugh. They knew something. No one listened. Wonder where those humans are today. His thoughts floated from past to present to future. The future? He shook his head. The present. All there is. He smiled. The present is a gift. Yes, a gift, alive to survive above ground. If the planet is to survive, drastic measures must be taken plus steps taken to prevent this from happening ever again. Maybe this started out as a bluff game. So where are those players today? No one knows. No one can know. There is no communication, no transmission. Satellites, if there are any left, cannot be communicated with. The hubs have been destroyed. Or maybe there is someone who knows. But where are they? Do they know which leader actually did the deed? So much destruction. So much pain and chaos. Those attached to technology are lost, literally. There are small bands of these young humans breaking into homes for food. Wow, no power of any kind. No way to cook. No way to start a fire if they would know how or what to do with one. Torhan reached into his pocket. He pulled out a box of stick matches. Gold. No one can eat food raw, certain death. Torhan had time to think. Clues. What does he need to remember? He looked up to the hazy, smoky sky. No blue. Wait. He remembered a prophecy. There were many, but this one. Torhan became excited. His breathing became rapid. There were 3 places. Have to choose one, closest one. Smiling, no device to confirm with directions. His breathing was getting intense. This woke Irene up. What? Do we have to leave now? Irene asked. The pup grunted. I remembered something. I know where we need to go. Just not sure exactly how to get there yet. The timing has to be perfect. This journey will reconnect us with our human ancestors. Home. Irene smiled. She looked down at the pup. Home. The city was a corpse. Concrete veins ran through its body, broken and lifeless, while hollow buildings stared down at her like blind eyes. Jo clutched the radio to her chest as if it were a talisman, her only anchor in a world that had been swallowed by silence. She hadn't heard a bird's song, a car's engine, or even the whisper of wind in what felt like an eternity. But just hours ago, the radio had spoken. In the static of the radio, she swore she heard his voice. Jo, find me. Her brother Jack had whispered through the crackling hum, the words half buried in distortion. It had been faint, fleeting, but unmistakable. I'll be waiting in the sound, the radio spoke. Her heart had lurched, half with hope, half with fear. She twisted the dial again now, desperate to hear him once more, but the radio gave nothing back. Please, she begged aloud, her voice trembling. Say something, anything. But the static had returned to its cruel indifference. Jo's footsteps echoed unnaturally against the empty streets as she moved through the skeletal remains of the city. The radio was a constant weight in her hands, the knob twisting. Beneath her trembling fingers, occasionally the static would falter, replaced by faint pops and hisses that made her pulse quicken. She thought she caught snippets of Jack's voice in the noise, a muffled word, a laugh, maybe even her name, but it was never enough to be certain. The city started to feel alive, but not in a way she could understand. She'd see movements in the corner of her eye, a shadow darting across a cracked window or the shifting of a pile of rubble. Once she thought she heard footsteps trailing her, their rhythm slightly off from her own. But every time she turned around, she found nothing. Only silence. Only the void. Get a grip, she muttered, pressing the radio closer to her chest. But her own voice sounded foreign, distorted by the absence of any other noise. She ducked into a shattered convenience store to catch her breath, the air inside thick with ash, dust, and decay. The shelves were long stripped bare, and the sunlight streaming through the broken windows cast jagged patterns across the floor. She set the radio down for a moment, her hands shaking too much to hold it steady. As she scanned the room, she saw something out of place. A small, folded piece of paper resting on the counter. She unfolded it, her breath catching when she saw Jack's handwriting scrawled across the page. Follow the sound. I'm close. Her legs nearly gave beneath her. Jack, she whispered, clutching the note so tightly it crumpled in her hand. Her desperation turned into resolve. She didn't know how the note had gotten there. Maybe she didn't want to know, but it didn't matter. He was alive. He had to be. She left the store and ventured deeper into the city. The buildings around her seemed taller, leaning in as if they were watching her. The shadows danced longer, darker, and the air felt heavy, pressing against her lungs. The radio sputtered to life again, and this time, she heard it clearly. Jack's voice, broken and faint, but unmistakable. Jo, almost there. She froze, the sound sending a jolt through her. Jack, she shouted into the static. Where are you? Tell me where. The voice didn't answer, but the static shifted, forming a new pattern, almost like it was leading her somewhere. She followed it, her pulse pounding as she passed derelict cars and crumbling remains of life. Her surroundings blurred as the static grew louder, rising to a deafening crescendo that made her wince. And then suddenly it stopped. Ahead of her stood a massive, rustic barn at the edge of the city. The silence was suffocating now, but she couldn't ignore the pull of the place. The radio buzzed faintly in her hands, almost like it was urging her forward. She hesitated at the entrance, her paranoia now screaming at her to turn back. The shadows here felt alive, shifting unnaturally against the light. But then she thought of Jack's note, his voice, his promise. "I'm close." She stepped inside, the air turning cold and stale around her. Jo pushed open the warped barn door, her breath quick and shallow. The metallic groan